Standing outside Class 1B, a girl mentioned that she had asked a boy if he remembered meeting her. The boy replied by asking her the exact same question, leaving the girl feeling like she could not ask it a second time. Sitting at her desk, she called out to Kimura, who stood shaking in front of her as he began to speak. Kimura pointed at her and declared that she had ruined her own chances, calling her a losing heroine. Kawashima questioned the term, and Kimura explained that he was just a background character whose role was to cheer on losing heroines like her. While riding his bike to school, Kimura recalled noticing something strange. Another boy had collided with a girl, ending up on the ground between her legs and groaning in pain. The girl accused him of touching her inappropriately, but the boy argued back that she was the one who bumped into him. Watching from his bike, Kimura noted the lucky pervert situation. Kimura reflected that the girl Iame Takabe later showed up as a transfer student, which he found cliché before noting a second abnormality. As the teacher assigned Iame her seat, she recognized the boy from the collision. The two started yelling at each other, demanding to know why they ended up in the exact same class, while Kimura sat between them. Kimura walked away frustrated by the cliché development of them being together at home, and at school realizing that this setup guaranteed there would be a losing heroine. He looked back and quietly stated that there was no way. Kimura spotted Kawashima crying as she repeated the news that the two of them were together at home and at school. Kimura realized that he was living in a strange world that functioned exactly like a romantic comedy centered entirely around the boy named I. He reasoned that this explained the empty seat right next to I and the presence of two main heroines. It also explained why I suddenly slipped and grabbed Iame by the chest in a perfectly timed accidental moment. Iame angrily called I a pervert while Kawashima checked to see if he was all right. Kimura concluded that the world was an incredibly old-fashioned romantic comedy based on their reactions. I said Kawashima's name as she looked down at him. I thanked Kawashima and complained about the violent new girl, but Kawashima gently scolded him and reminded him that Iame had just transferred to their school. Smiling brightly, Kawashima told I that he should be the one to support Iame. Watching this, Kimura noted in shock that she was way too kind and had just put her rival ahead of herself. Kimura suddenly shouted at Kawashima, warning her that if she did that I would never notice her, causing her to jolt in surprise. Leaning in closely, Kawashima asked Kimura to teach her since he was well versed in love. Kimura reflected that this was how the whole situation had happened. Sitting at a desk surrounded by stacks of books, Kimura decided to mobilize every bit of his knowledge regarding rom-coms. He firmly made up his mind that he would make Kawashima win. Back in the classroom, Kimura sat facing Kawashima and began sorting out the relationships, confirming with her that she and I were childhood friends. Kawashima happily explained that they were close childhood friends, but she had moved away when she was 6. She then slumped over her desk in depression, admitting that it seemed like I did not remember anything at all. Kimura asked if they had made a childhood marriage promise, to which Kawashima reacted with confused surprise. Looking serious, Kimura repeated his question, asking her directly if the two of them had made a marriage promise. Blushing heavily, Kawashima frantically explained that it did happen, but it was just them fooling around as kids. Kimura immediately told her that this was exactly what she needed to bring up. Kimura pointed at her and shouted that her character was currently too weak to compete with Takabe because she had no sharpness to her personality. He told her to look at Takabe, explaining that she was a textbook tsundere whose sharp contrast made her amazing. Gesturing with his hands, Kimura emphasized that Takabe's impact just kept piling up, leaving Kawashima slightly overwhelmed. Kimura instructed Kawashima to fight back using a past episode, declaring that whoever put it all out there would win. He ordered her to go tell I one more time and lay her past bare, and Kawashima nervously gulped and agreed. Later outside, Kawashima approached I and called his name, making him turn around. Standing a short distance away from him as the wind blew, she referred to herself as the girl from back then. Blushing and looking vulnerable, she asked I if he remembered her. I stood completely still, his eyes widening in surprise as the wind blew leaves past him. The two stood far apart in silence as the wind continued to blow between them. I asked what she had said, completely missing her question. Kawashima quickly apologized and claimed the wind was too loud. Kawashima nervously waved her hands and laughed, trying to play off the awkward moment. She told I to never mind it with a big smile. From down the hall, Kimura yelled out that a teacher was looking for her. Kawashima panicked, chanting that there was no way she could do it, while Kimura angrily asked why she dodged the situation in such an overused way again. Kimura sighed and admitted he understood that the thought of Ai not remembering was scary, but tried to explain that statistically speaking it was unlikely. Kawashima weakly tried to interject. Blushing heavily and grabbing her twin tails, Kawashima confessed that seeing Ai up close was so cool that she just blanked out, prompting Kimura to exasperatedly shout her name. Kimura instructed her to make Ai remember their childhood friendship and marriage promise first, and then create a gap between her past and present self. He told her to use her twin tails to fuel her tsundere side, but Kawashima argued that suddenly acting like that would just make her seem emotionally unstable. Kimura asked if she had any specific memories with Ai. Kawashima recalled a nearby park where they used to play all the time, and Kimura repeated the word thoughtfully. Realizing that a park full of memories was the perfect setting, Kimura excitedly ordered her to send Ai an anonymous letter telling him she would be waiting there. Kawashima asked what he meant by that, and Kimura began to clarify. He pointed out that their town had a ridiculous amount of parks, listing off several variations with different levels of nostalgic value, which Kawashima hesitantly acknowledged. Kimura explained that vaguely asking someone to meet at that park would normally leave a person confused about which one. Catching on, Kawashima realized that if Ai remembered what their specific park of memories meant, he would definitely show up. The thought of meeting him there hung in the air. Imagining Ai arriving at the park and recognizing her from their past, Kawashima declared that he was bound to remember their history together, while Kimura pumped his fist in agreement. Kimura patted her on the shoulder, telling her exactly what came next. Gripping her shoulders intensely, Kimura ordered her to confess her feelings right then and there. Kawashima balked at the idea of confessing. Kimura insisted that she had to, reminding her of the perfect setup involving the park of memories and a childhood friend who'd a marriage promise. He dramatically shouted that there was nothing left for her to do but confess, before suddenly yelling for her to wait. Kimura urged Kawashima to listen, explaining that a race for love only gets harsher the longer it drags on as more rivals appear. He advised her that if she wanted to win, she needed to settle it in a short and decisive battle. Kimura angrily yelled that she could do it, but Kawashima nervously stammered that she could not. Walking home with Kimura, Kawashima tearfully explained that when she met Ai after so long, he did not remember her, making her feel like it was all just in the past for him. She panicked, expressing her fear that he would not show up, and frantically asked what she should do if he was not there. Kimura told her that was not the case, explaining that Ai most likely remembered, but just had not connected the Kawashima from the past with the Kawashima she was right now. Kimura added that it just meant she had become that much more charming, and told her not to put herself down. Blushing, Kawashima told him not to flatter her too much. Kimura confidently declared that she would definitely meet the person she was waiting for, because they were in a rom-com, which Kawashima quietly questioned. They arrived at Sakura Park, but Kawashima stopped walking. She expressed her doubts again, insisting that there was no way Ai remembered the past. Kawashima suddenly stopped and gasped Ai's name in shock as she saw him standing there waiting. Ai stood alone in the middle of the playground, proving that he had shown up. Kimura celebrated their success, declaring that they had won and that it was Kawashima's victory. Kimura urged Kawashima to go get him, and she nervously agreed while gripping her bag. Suddenly, Ai called out the name Iame, causing Kawashima to freeze in shock. Kimura reacted in complete disbelief as Iame Takabe appeared, asking Ai what he wanted. Kimura panicked, wondering why Takabe was at the park, before realizing that since it was so close to the school, it must have been on her way home and had become her regular spot. Ai asked Takabe if she was the one who gave him the letter. Watching this, Kimura realized in horror that Ai was going to assume Takabe was the sender. Ai asked Takabe how she even knew about the park, and she defensively replied that it was just a shortcut on her way home. Kimura urged Kawashima to speak up, insisting she could still intervene. Meanwhile, Ai asked Takabe if they had played at this park when they were little. As Takabe walked past him with the wind blowing, Ai concluded that she was the girl from his past. Kimura desperately told Kawashima that there was still time and urged her to go to him, but she quietly agreed with Ai's misunderstanding instead. Kawashima turned and walked away, sadly stating that for Ai she was already just something from the past. Gripping his bag strapped tightly in a clenched fist, Kimura quietly accepted the situation, noting that she had lost once again. Standing together by the bridge, Kawashima admitted to Kimura that she had lost. Kimura looked down in serious frustration. Kimura suddenly hopped onto his bike and instructed Kawashima to wait there, leaving her confused. Speeding off on his bike, Kimura noted that the school was close to the park. Breathing heavily as he rode toward the school building, Kimura declared that there was still a way. He slammed the door open and burst into a room where other students were working. A student yelled at him, demanding to know what he was doing and stating that it was the broadcast room, but Kimura just apologized and pushed past him to borrow the equipment. Pushing a slider on the mixing board, Kimura reasoned that he had to act because he was the only one who knew the truth. He reflected on how Kawashima was always kind to others but ended up stuck playing the losing side. As the school's outdoor speakers buzzed to life, Kimura decided that just for today things would be different. Screeching into the microphone, Kimura yelled that he wanted her to win, calling out to I am Takabe from Class 1B so that she and I could hear it outside. Kimura ordered Takabe to come to the faculty office, immediately leaving her completely shocked. The broadcast student begged him to stop, but Kimura announced he had one more thing to say as Kawashima listened from afar. Over the speakers, Kimura stated that he had something to say to the one with no confidence who could not move forward, making Kawashima recognize his voice. Speaking directly into the microphone, Kimura told her to take her past. He instructed her to paint it over with who she was right now as the wind blew around her. A hand tightly gripped a bag strap. Kimura smiled as the broadcast student pulled him away from the microphone, while outside Takabe walked away from the park. Kawashima rushed over and bowed, deeply calling out Ai's name as he turned to look at her. Ai said her name in surprise, and a heavily blushing Kawashima nervously tried to speak. Later that night under the moonlight, Kimura was walking his bike when he stopped and called out to Kawashima, who turned to greet him with a bright smile. Kimura asked what she was doing there and if she had headed home with Ai. She explained that he went back first before complimenting Kimura on being amazing. Kimura rubbed his neck and admitted that he still got chewed out pretty badly for his actions, then prompted her to continue. He asked what Ai's reply to her confession was. Kawashima laughed nervously and stammered. Kawashima happily announced that she did it. Confused, Kimura asked if she meant it in a celebratory way, but she quickly clarified that it was not like that. Blushing, Kawashima admitted that she had only asked Ai about homework, prompting Kimura to yell that she should have asked something completely different. Kimura argued that there was something much more important to discuss in that situation than homework. Kawashima agreed, but explained that Ai wanted to keep it short because his little sister had a fever. Kimura noted that having a little sister was typical for a main character before she added one more thing. As they continued walking together, Kawashima explained that just the fact that Ai remembered her from when they were little was enough to make her happy. Kimura asked if she waited all this time just to tell him that, pointing out that she and Ai could have easily missed each other. Kawashima confidently replied that they would not have missed each other, reminding Kimura of what he said himself. Smiling back at him under the night sky, Kawashima repeated his claim that a person will definitely meet the one they are waiting for in a romantic comedy. She explained that was why she chose to believe it. Kimura stared at her in surprise, reflecting again that Kawashima was the losing heroine. Kimura stated that I really did not know what he was missing, adding that if it were him, he would have chosen her without a doubt. Kawashima reacted in pure shock. Kimura clarified that he meant it literally because he genuinely liked her. He pointed out that he would not go this far for her if he did not like her. Kawashima stammered as she tried to process his words. Kimura admitted that he could not step in between her Ai and Takabe. He started to mention how the world functioned. Kimura concluded that the world had no interest in him, making this his way of resisting. He quietly reflected that Kawashima always got the short end of the stick, and he just wanted her to finally catch a break. He then noticed Kawashima stammering the start of a word over and over. Kawashima was completely overwhelmed, blushing furiously with swirling eyes as she continued to stammer. As they continued walking down the quiet street, Kimura silently reiterated his desire for her to win. Back in the classroom, the teacher announced that they would be changing seats next week, causing the students to react in surprise. Kimura smiled mischievously, realizing this was the perfect chance for Ai and Kawashima to naturally close their distance if they ended up sitting next to each other. He noted that seat changes were usually decided by lottery, so he would need a strategy. The teacher announced to the class that they would rearrange the seats based on the results of the next midterm test. Both Kawashima and Kimura reacted in shock to the news that it would be by test results, with Kawashima remembering her class rank at enrollment was last at 36 out of 36, while Kimura was exactly in the middle at 18. I looked up in mild confusion as Kimura noted that I's enrollment rank was first in the class, realizing that with the massive difference in grades between I and Kawashima, there was only one thing to do. Kimura yelled that she had no choice but to study as Kawashima frantically began working through her textbooks with tears in her eyes. Looking at the school building, Kimura reflected on a recent trend in romantic comedies, while a voice called out a student's name in the background. Kimura noted that main characters were usually unusually smart. Observing I standing at his desk, he realized this naturally applied to him as well before considering Kawashima's situation on the other hand. A teacher kindly told a dejected student she could return to her seat, causing Kimura to note that the kindness hurt, while Kawashima happily counted on her fingers nearby. Kimura reflected that, along with I's perfect grades, the double heroines were also part of his world. Watching Takabe glare at I while he chatted with other students, Kimura concluded that it would be absurd to assume otherwise. Takabe suddenly threw an eraser directly at the back of I's head, making Kimura jolt in his seat as he noted that it was unusually noisy behind him today. Kimura set those thoughts aside, recalling the teacher's announcement about rearranging the seats according to the next midterm results. Kimura reasoned that since I's grades were unquestionably number one, if Kawashima could secure the seat next to him, the romantic tension would skyrocket, naturally resulting in massive romantic comedy progress. Looking back at a determined Kawashima, Kimura firmly decided that she absolutely had to get the seat next to I. As Kimura walked down the hallway wondering if there was a quick way to improve Kawashima's grades, a stack of books suddenly tumbled to the floor nearby. A flustered Kawashima tried to gather the dropped books and called out to Kimura. He realized she was helping the teacher again and reflected on how much of a softie she was. Kimura suddenly yelled, internally calling her an intangible cultural heritage heroine, leaving Kawashima completely bewildered by the term. Kimura grabbed the tall stack of books and told her to hurry up and take them to the reference room, with him prompting a surprised response from Kawashima. Kawashima looked at him with a blush and began to stammer. As Kimura walked ahead carrying the books, Kawashima recalled his earlier confession where he explicitly told her that he liked her. Still flustered by the memory of his words, Kawashima quietly thanked him and tried to continue speaking. Standing across from Kimura in the hallway, Kawashima asked how she should take his statement from yesterday about liking her. Kimura looked surprised and asked what she meant. Kawashima stammered, prompting Kimura to quietly state that he understood. Looking away, Kimura explained that he liked how straightforward she was with her feelings. He elaborated that her eyes lit up whenever she talked about I, and that it was fun to see her getting all lovey-dovey. Kimura firmly stated that he wanted to see a losing heroine like her actually win. Kawashima gulped in surprise, recalling his confession from the day before. Kimura proudly declared that he was her #1 fan. Flushed red, Kawashima yelled in disbelief that he meant that kind of like. Kimura asked what she meant, leaving Kawashima to realize she had completely misunderstood the situation on her own, while Kimura asked if he was the one being misunderstood. Waving her hands frantically, Kawashima clarified that was not what she meant before trailing off to start a new thought. A finger pointed at Kawashima as Kimura told her that the first step to winning was to become friends with I. Kawashima reacted in shock, asking if that meant something else. Blushing heavily and grabbing her face, Kawashima asked if she currently looked like more than just a friend to I. Kimura loudly noted her seriously positive thinking. Kimura commanded her to listen up, explaining that in a classic romantic comedy, the heroine does not suddenly become the girlfriend. He emphasized that a girl who is not even a friend is the same as background scenery. Kawashima complained that this was just ridiculous. Kimura pointed out that in reality she was too nervous to even talk to I, making the seat change the perfect opportunity to naturally grow closer if he taught her. Kawashima weakly repeated the idea of being taught before slumping over in defeat. Holding her head in dread, Kawashima confessed that it would be scary if I got disappointed in her for not knowing simple things, calling herself pathetic. Kimura reassured her that it was not that bad and that even I would not say such things. Crying, Kawashima told him to take a look for himself, and Kimura sighed and agreed. Kimura angrily yelled at her for not understanding a simple formula. Bawling, Kawashima revealed that during exam prep, her little brother tutored her 15 hours a day for an entire year. Stunned, Kimura asked how she even managed to pass the entrance exam. Sniffling with a smile, Kawashima explained that I had always been good at studying, so she figured he would definitely get into a top school. Weeping in respect, Kimura congratulated her on passing before Kawashima added another reason. Kawashima happily declared that she wanted to become someone who could proudly walk beside Ai. Kimura groaned, feeling like she was getting more and more deified in his eyes. Kawashima asked how to solve a part of her work. Kimura struggled to explain it, leaning over the table in thought until someone suddenly interjected and offered to help. Takabe leaned over the table and explained to Kawashima how to apply the formula. As Kawashima said Takabe's name in surprise, Kimura silently recalled that Takabe was Ai's fiancé. Takabe asked if they were having a study session. Kimura confirmed it, and Kawashima happily invited Takabe to join them. Takabe bluntly stated that she hated studying because she could grasp things from class and textbooks, seeing no point in spending extra time on it. Kawashima was completely crushed by Takabe's natural genius, while Kimura urged Kawashima not to lose to a winning heroine. Kawashima forced a cracked smile and stammered in defeat, while Kimura desperately yelled for her not to lose. Looking at a mental lineup of the top students, Kimura suddenly realized that if the class rankings stayed as they were, Ai and Takabe would end up sitting right next to each other. Ai walked into the library and waved, prompting an excited greeting from Kawashima. Takabe instantly glared and yelled at Ai for daring to show his face and talk to her. Ai angrily shot back that he was not even talking to her, leaving Kawashima standing between them in shock. Kawashima frantically tried to stop them as Takabe accused Ai of barging in on her in the bath the previous day. Ai told her to stop calling him names and argued that it was a mutual accident, while Kimura silently noted that something definitely gets lost in those situations. Kawashima's eyes went completely blank as she stammered in shock about the two of them taking a bath. Kimura mentally noted that she had just lost half her health and ordered her to snap out of it. Kimura pictured the cliché bath encounter, thinking to himself that Ai and Takabe sounded like they were living in an old romantic comedy world. Takabe gritted her teeth in anger and accused Ai of breaking her headband. Ai pointed back at her and argued that she was the one at fault for leaving it in a place like that, making Takabe yell in indignation. Kimura interrupted them by pointing to a sign and nervously reminding them to cut it out because they were in the library. Ignoring him completely, Takabe loudly shouted at Ai that the headband was something really important. Ai yelled that he had enough and stormed out, violently slamming the library doors shut behind him. Takabe aggressively sat back down in a huff. Kimura concluded that this incident perfectly explained why they were both in such foul moods that morning. Out in the hallway, Ai asked about a headband as he opened his hand to show the broken pieces to Kawashima, who nervously confirmed it while cursing internally. Kawashima inspected the pieces and noted that it broke clean in half. Ai rubbed his neck and admitted that he did not really understand girls' stuff. Ai directly asked Kawashima if she would come shopping with him after class. Kawashima jolted with a massive blush while Kimura watched from a distance and groaned that they were heading into another trope. Kimura envisioned the disastrous cliché scenario where Ai and Kawashima buy the headband together, only for Takabe to happen to see them, causing their misunderstandings to escalate even further. Ai explained to Takabe that the truth was he and Kawashima had just gone to buy her a new headband together. Watching the two blush at each other, Kimura reflected that this would end up being just another event that deepened their relationship. Kimura panicked, realizing that to Kawashima this must look like a nice chance to go shopping alone with Ai. Knowing he could not let that happen, he reached out as Kawashima began to call out to Ai. Kawashima told Ai that she thought the headband must be irreplaceable to Takabe, explaining that even if he bought a new one, it would not fill that void. Kawashima added that she thought it was more important for him to sincerely apologize, and Ai agreed she was right. Overcome with emotion, Kimura silently praised Kawashima for not getting swayed by the opportunity right in front of her and backing off on her own. Ai promised that he would say sorry when he got home. Hearing this, Kimura gasped in sudden realization. Kimura instantly rushed forward and grabbed Ai by the shoulder, yelling for him to hold on. Outside the school building, Ai looked at Kimura in complete confusion as Kimura stared back in absolute silence. The next day in the classroom, Kawashima happily approached Takabe. Takabe acknowledged her and Kawashima thanked her for helping her study the previous afternoon. I then held out the repaired headband to Takabe and started to explain. He told her that it was the result of their time after school the previous day, recalling how Kawashima had eagerly suggested they fix it. In the memory, I nervously asked if they could really do it, but Kimura firmly told him that it was not about whether they could or could not. Looking down intensely, Kimura had declared that what truly mattered was actually doing it. The three of them had then gone to a discount store to buy glue, looked up a repair guide on a phone, and worked together to mend the break. They carefully pressed the two broken crescent moon halves together until the repair held strong. Back in the present, Takabe stared down at the fixed headband in her hands with a soft, stunned expression. Kawashima apologized that the repair was a little off, but Takabe quietly revealed that the headband was something she had received from her mother. I nervously apologized to her. Blushing, Takabe scolded him, telling him that he could have just apologized sincerely right from the start. Takabe huffed and looked away with a blush while Kawashima laughed happily, and I looked down in relief that the argument was over. Walking away down the hallway, Kimura smiled to himself, glad to see that the issue was resolved. Kimura reflected that if I had just gone home after their fight, he would have carried the guilt, looked up how to fix it on his phone at home, and worked hard to repair it all by himself. Kimura realized that letting I fix the headband alone would have only deepened his bond with Takabe, which was the exact situation he needed to prevent. Kimura casually remarked to the girls that repairing the headband as a group was much more efficient than doing it alone anyway. In the classroom, Kawashima told Takabe that she should thank Kimura for taking the initiative to help fix the headband. Kawashima explained that things would not have worked out if Kimura had not taken charge, prompting Takabe to look at Kimura thoughtfully as he nervously stumbled over his words. Takabe thanked him but immediately told him to focus on helping Kawashima with her studies, instead suggesting he would be better off with her. Kawashima asked Takabe to confirm if the upcoming seat changes were based entirely on their grades, and Takabe casually agreed that they were. When Takabe asked her about her previous exam rank, Kawashima sheepishly admitted she placed 36th, prompting Takabe to point out that she was dead last. Takabe promised to tutor Kawashima intensely for the next week, causing Kawashima to squeal in dread, while Kimura walked home satisfied with how things were progressing. The midterm results were soon posted on the bulletin board outside Class 1B. The midterm rankings were revealed, showing I firmly holding the top position in the class. Despite the intense tutoring, the list revealed that Kawashima had still finished in 36th place. Takabe aggressively shook Kawashima, demanding to know why her rank had not changed, while Kawashima tearfully apologized, and Kimura watched the scene in utter disbelief. Kimura realized that with Takabe placing 18th and himself 19th, his plan for Kawashima to sit next to I was falling apart as Takabe noticed something unusual on the board. Kimura turned to Takabe and admitted he expected her to rank much higher than 18th place. Takabe explained that she preferred to be grouped with her friends if given the opportunity. Takabe confessed she assumed Kawashima would rank around the middle, suddenly realizing she had miscalculated entirely. Kimura was astounded to realize Takabe had intentionally aimed for the exact middle of the class rankings just as the teacher called the class to order to begin arranging the seats. The teacher announced that the students who placed 1st and 36th would be paired up, causing Kawashima to gasp in shock. When the students questioned the arrangement, the teacher explained that pairing high and low scorers together was designed to foster mutual academic improvement. The teacher added that arranging seats strictly by top grades would skew the class balance, leaving a frustrated Takabe gritting her teeth as she realized her plan had completely backfired. Kimura looked at the seating chart and realized the arrangement was not going to follow a standard numerical order after all. The teacher ordered the students who placed 4th and 25th to move to the front row before concluding the assignments and instructing everyone to take their new designated seats. As desks clattered across the room, the layout on the board confirmed that 36th place was paired directly with 1st place, while 19th place sat beside 18th. While I quietly observed his new seatmate, a heavily blushing Kawashima sat beside him, leaving a sweating Kimura to settle into his seat as 19th place. I welcomed Kawashima as his new seat neighbor, and she happily agreed as Kimura watched the pairing succeed from a distance. Kawashima was ecstatic, celebrating what she saw as a direct shortcut to becoming a winning heroine, while Kimura lamented his own seat assignment right next to Takabe. Crossing her arms, Takabe haughtily declared to Ai that she was glad she no longer had to sit near him. Takabe pointed out that she still had Kawashima nearby while Ai grumbled for her to keep talking. Kimura reflected on the immense narrative weight of a winning heroine, noting that Takabe naturally possessed the power to remain clustered near the main character. Takabe suddenly turned her attention to Kimura and addressed him directly from her desk. When a surprised Kimura pointed to himself, Takabe explained that she still had not properly repaid her debt to him. Takabe argued that Kimura tutoring Kawashima did not count as repayment since Kawashima still finished dead last, but she insisted she would find another way to settle it. Kimura suddenly leaned forward and firmly grabbed Takabe's hands, shouting his thanks, and completely catching her off guard. Takabe blushed furiously with swirling eyes, letting out a shocked scream at his sudden gesture. Satisfied that Takabe was cooperative, Kimura resolved to show his gratitude before deciding it was time for Kawashima to launch a full-on romantic attack on Ai. Kawashima quietly told Kimura that if he had not given her this golden opportunity, things would be very different. She smiled warmly, admitting that her new seat assignment would never have been this much fun. She hesitated for a moment before continuing her thought. Blushing softly, Kawashima offered a radiant smile and told Kimura that all of her happiness was entirely thanks to him. Kimura stood completely frozen, stared back in absolute silence, and struggled to process her sincere and heartfelt words. Kimura admitted to Kawashima that he had not actually been thinking that far ahead. Takabe was left completely bewildered and flustered, frantically trying to make sense of what had just happened. Looking at Ai's empty desk neighbor spot, Kimura reflected that sitting next to the main character was the classic unshakable position for a rom-com heroine. Kawashima accidentally bypassed multiple romantic tropes, cheerfully mentioning that she had already completed the class journal during her free time and changed the vase water hours ago. Instead of sharing a tense, isolated moment with Ai when they got locked in the reference room, Kawashima instantly broadcasted a message to their entire class group chat requesting rescue. Kimura slammed the door open in sheer frustration, yelling at Kawashima for using modern technology to ruin what should have been a classic romantic setup. Kimura loudly scolded a tearful Kawashima for completely wasting a perfect romantic flag opportunity. When Kawashima sheepishly whispered that they actually did get nervous in the cramped room, Kimura ordered her to start capitalizing on those heart-pounding moments. From inside the storage room, Ai turned around to look at them with a highly curious expression. Chapter 3 of their journey began with a focused mission to make Kawashima and Ai an umbrella in the rain. As rain began to drizzle over the school, Kimura rode his bike home, reflecting that the path to making Kawashima win still felt incredibly long. Kimura stopped his bike to put on his raincoat, noting that, while a sudden rain usually triggers romantic events, he assumed it would have nothing to do with him. Kimura spotted Ai running through the downpour without an umbrella, immediately identifying it as the start of a classic romantic cliché. Ai asked Kimura if he was taking shelter too, but Kimura replied that he was simply putting on his raincoat, leaving Ai to sit down on a nearby bench looking dejected. A sudden realization hit Kimura as he realized that if Kawashima were to show up at this exact moment, they could trigger a major event. Picturing them sharing a romantic umbrella moment, Kimura pulled out his phone to manually coordinate a coincidental encounter for Kawashima. Kimura messaged Kawashima informing her that Ai was currently sheltering from the rain at Tsumugi Park and urging her to take advantage of the opportunity. Kimura watched Ai from a distance, knowing his next task was to somehow keep him at the park until Kawashima finally arrived. Worrying that someone might pick Ai up and ruin the setup, Kimura asked him if he had a phone, only for Ai to explain that he owned a cheap old model with a terrible battery. Ai added that his phone had already died by noon, leaving a relieved Kimura to realize that the danger of Ai calling someone for a ride was completely gone. Ai lamented that Ai would chew him out if he did not get home, soon explaining that he was in charge of making dinner, which made Kimura realize Ai fit the classic domestic protagonist trope. Watching Ai wring out his wet clothes, Kimura reflected that Ai possessed every single quality of a romantic comedy main character. Kimura realized that if Ai rushed home to cook, Kawashima would miss her chance entirely, making it critical to find a way to delay him. A stray cat suddenly leaped onto Kimura's back, causing him to panic and desperately try to pull the stubborn animal off his coat. The stray cat loudly hissed and scratched at Kimura as he struggled to pry it off. Hearing the noise, I turned around and immediately froze at the sight of the cat. I gasped in pure terror at the sight of the cat, while a confused Kimura held the animal and asked what the problem was. Kimura noted that the cat seemed quite friendly, completely unaware that I was currently cowering on the bench in absolute dread. Terrified by the cat, I suddenly bolted off into the pouring rain, leaving a stunned Kimura calling out after him. In his desperate panic to escape, the cat-eye tried to claim that the rain was letting up, even though Kimura argued it was still a massive downpour. Kimura warned I that running off in the cold rain would make him sick, but then he suddenly realized that a sick main character would trigger a classic home visit event. Kimura envisioned Takabe visiting Ai's home to nurse him back to health and cook him porridge, realizing this would inevitably lead to a massive romantic development between them. Knowing Kawashima would arrive soon and wanting to prevent the sickness event, Kimura grabbed Ai's shirt and ordered him to stay put under the shelter. When the stray cat meowed again, Kimura held it up towards him, causing a terrified Ai to let out an absolute scream of horror. I was completely broken and sank to his knees in tears, prompting a calm Kimura to explain that he had safely relocated the cat to the playground. I frantically asked how Kimura knew about his severe cat phobia and begged him not to tell Iame, but Kimura assured him that he would keep it a secret. Kimura knew that if Takabe found out, she would easily tease Ai by exploiting his weakness, completely neutralizing any competition. Kimura looked at Ai's puzzled expression and asked him why he was staring like that. I admitted that people usually teased him whenever he mentioned his fear of cats, but Kimura's blunt and non-judgmental response made I feel relieved about his trauma. Kimura reassured I that his fear was perfectly normal, pointing out that just as some people disliked dogs, it made total sense for others to dislike cats as well. Adjusting his wet raincoat, Kimura calmly assured I that absolutely no one would make fun of him for a fear like that. I stood in silence, looking visibly touched by Kimura's unexpected kindness and understanding. While Kimura quietly celebrated avoiding the sick visit crisis, I remarked that he finally understood why Kawashima trusted Kimura so much. Kimura questioned the word in confusion before suddenly gasping as he spotted someone approaching the park. Kawashima rushed up through the rain holding an umbrella and called out to Ai, who looked back in surprise as she arrived. Kawashima nervously stammered a greeting and offered Ai one of the two umbrellas she brought, causing a sweating Kimura to facepalm at her, spoiling the chance to a single umbrella. Kawashima happily confirmed her offer with a bright smile, while a completely deadpan Kimura watched her fail the setup from the background. As I prepared to take the umbrella, Kawashima leaned over and whispered her thanks to Kimura, who stood there wondering why she had to bring two. Kimura furiously demanded to know why she brought two umbrellas instead of sharing one, but Kawashima nervously explained she wanted to lend the second one to Kimura, prompting him to shout that he did not need her extra kindness. Kimura suddenly heard a splashing sound nearby and glanced over in curiosity. Looking down, Kimura gasped in shock upon realizing the stray cat's sharp claws had torn deep slashes straight through his raincoat. I remarked that a cat's claws were practically deadly weapons as he started to walk, while Kawashima reached out in surprise to ask him about the cat. Holding their umbrellas, I and Kawashima bumped into each other slightly as they began walking home side by side. Kimura pulled up his damaged coat and told them he would get wet anyway, insisting there was no need to worry about him. Waving a brief farewell, Kimura hopped onto his bike and rode out into the downpour. I and Kawashima stood together under their umbrellas, silently watching as Kimura sped away into the heavy rain. Looking at the road ahead, I quietly began to reflect on what Kimura had said to him earlier. I smiled warmly and pointed out that even though Kimura had warned him about catching a cold, he was really only worrying about everyone else the entire time. Blushing softly, Kawashima smiled and happily agreed that was exactly the kind of person Kimura was. With their umbrellas held high, the two walked off together side by side through the gentle rain. Kimura continued riding away on his bike through the heavy downpour. Walking alongside her under his umbrella, I suddenly called out to Kawashima. I asked what she and Kimura were always talking about, causing Kawashima to gasp in sudden shock. Kawashima panicked with swirling eyes, frantically remembering that all of her conversations with Kimura were entirely about how much she liked Ai. Shaking with nervousness under the rain, Kawashima struggled to come up with an excuse about what she and Kimura discussed. She nervously stammered that they were only talking about giving and receiving advice, prompting a curious eye to ask what kind of advice she meant. Kawashima blushed furiously and confessed she was getting advice about him, leaving Ai completely wide-eyed and shocked. Thinking back to how aggressively yet sincerely Kimura had cheered her on and encouraged her to win, Kawashima tightly gripped her umbrella. Steeling her resolve under the open sky, Kawashima turned to Ai and loudly confessed that she liked him. Ai stood frozen in absolute disbelief, his eyes wide as her words echoed in the rainy street. Kawashima kept her head bowed, deeply softly repeating her confession to him. As Ai stood there, he suddenly pieced together all of Kimura's intense actions from earlier, from passionately yelling at him about catching a cold to physically grabbing his shirt and keeping his secrets. Misinterpreting the situation entirely, Ai began to process what he thought was Kimura's hidden affection for him. Ai gasped in pure shock, wondering aloud if Kimura actually had romantic feelings for him, leaving a completely stunned Kawashima to call his name in disbelief. Kawashima frantically waved her hands to correct the misunderstanding, but a flustered Ai insisted he understood perfectly and urged her not to speak of it in front of Kimura before walking away. Ai looked back over his shoulder to continue his explanation while Kawashima waited anxiously for him to finish. Ai smiled softly and gently confessed that he already had someone else that he liked, catching Kawashima completely off guard. Kawashima stood completely frozen, her mind going entirely blank in dumbfounded silence under her umbrella. Somewhere far away on the rainy road, Kimura let out a loud sneeze as he continued to ride his bike home. While sweeping up after class, Kawashima looked extremely gloomy, prompting a worried Kimura to observe her in silence. Kimura approached her and suggested that she ask Ai to hang out since tomorrow was a day off, causing Kawashima to gasp in shock at the idea. Kawashima stammered and asked if he meant a date, which made Kimura ask why she was stuttering so much as she gripped her broom in sheer panic. Shaking with a heavy blush, Kawashima intensely looked at Kimura and suddenly suggested that they practice dating first. Kimura dropped his jaw in complete disbelief, letting out a loud yell of confusion just as he was about to open his can of coffee. Chapter 4 of their journey began with Kawashima nervously preparing herself in front of a mirror to build up her confidence. When they met for their practice run, Kimura pointed out that she was 15 minutes early, and a depressed Kawashima admitted she was too anxious to sleep, despite it only being practice. Kimura looked at her, recalling how she had actually managed to confess her feelings to Ai at the park, despite her anxiety. Kawashima slumped into a deep state of gloom, leaving a sweating Kimura to wonder why she was dragging the entire atmosphere down. Kimura tried to cheer her up by pointing out how cute her outfit was, explaining it would be a waste to stay gloomy, and asking if she thought Ai would find her cute too. Blushing heavily, Kawashima offered a gentle smile and quietly admitted she hoped Ai would think so, which made Kimura smile in relief. When Kawashima confessed she had no idea what people actually did on dates, Kimura recommended going to a movie as the safest option for a first outing. Kimura explained that amusement parks were too stressful due to long lines and too many choices, whereas a movie followed by dinner allowed them to naturally talk about the film afterward. At the movie theater counter, the clerk casually asked if they were a couple, sending a completely shocked Kawashima into a panic while Kimura stammered for words. The clerk clarified that the theater was currently offering a special discount specifically for couples. Looking at the sign outlining discounts for kissing, hugging, or holding hands, Kimura realized they had accidentally triggered a classic romantic comedy event. Kawashima completely short-circuited in embarrassment, with steam rising from her head, prompting a frantic Kimura to try and calm her down. Kimura quickly requested 2 standard price tickets to defuse the situation, but Kawashima suddenly pulled on his shirt and told him to wait. Looking away with a heavy blush, Kawashima nervously argued that since this was supposed to be a practice date, they should go through with it. Kawashima steeled her resolve, thinking that she would never be able to successfully confess for real if she could not even get it right during this practice run. Kimura panicked and bolted backward, desperately shouting at Kawashima to wait and hold on. Ignoring his warnings, Kawashima raised herself up onto her tiptoes to lean in close as a sweating Kimura begged her to stop. Kimura remained frozen, sweat dripping down his neck as the space between them vanished. At the very last second, Kimura raised his arm and successfully blocked her face, stopping her right before their lips could meet. Kimura reasoned that while a kiss would certainly make for a major romantic milestone, doing so right now would completely ruin their plans. Kimura passionately explained that kissing before actually dating would cause their romantic momentum to peak too early and crash down like an upside-down V, which would only lead her straight to a losing heroine route. Kimura pointed out that she had been acting strangely since the previous day and asked her what had happened, causing Kawashima to slump back into a gloomy silence. Kawashima quietly confessed to him that I had admitted he already liked someone else. Kimura gasped in complete shock, loudly asking her if she had actually gone ahead and confessed her feelings to I. Deciding they needed a proper place to discuss the situation, Kimura suggested they find a quiet cafe to sit down and talk. Sitting inside the cafe, Kawashima explained that, although she had told I she liked him, he had completely misunderstood her confession, before mentioning that he already liked someone else. Kawashima admitted that she became terrified of hearing his actual response once the words were out, and that she had only suggested the practice date to find some confidence. She explained that she was desperately searching for something that would help her finally move forward, while Kimura watched her sympathetically. Overcome with emotion, Kawashima began to weep, admitting she had never imagined that confessing her love would turn out to be so terrifying. A single tear dropped directly into her glass, splashing against the ice. Kimura remained completely silent, looking down as he processed the weight of her heartbreak. Sitting across the table from her, Kimura slowly began to speak. Breaking the heavy silence, Kimura suddenly erupted into an incredibly enthusiastic cheer, loudly celebrating the fact that she had actually managed to make a confession. Kimura enthusiastically declared that her confession took an immense amount of courage, praising her as truly amazing and calling it a massive step forward. Kawashima stared back with teary-wide eyes, deeply moved by Kimura's passionate and positive reaction to her confession. Kimura raised a finger and pointed out that there was still a very real chance the person I claimed to like was actually her. Kimura reasoned that I might have simply gotten embarrassed and been unable to admit his feelings, directly warning her that giving up out of fear now would only lock her into the losing route. Inspired by his words, Kawashima stood up and fiercely declared that she had not lost yet. Kawashima suddenly stopped and blinked in quiet surprise. Kimura smiled warmly, happily confirming that she was absolutely right. Sitting comfortably in his seat, Kimura reiterated that she had indeed not lost the race yet. Kawashima stared at Kimura with wide, blushing eyes, silently struck by his unwavering support. She reflected on how much she had grown through his constant encouragement. Kimura looked at her with a serious but encouraging expression, telling her that she needed to keep moving forward. Kawashima slumped onto the table in total embarrassment, prompting Kimura to gently tease her by pointing out that simply moving forward was still much easier than trying to force a kiss. Kawashima frantically apologized for panicking earlier, but Kimura reassured her that he understood, advising her to channel that same bold energy when she was around I. Kimura thoughtfully stroked his chin, wondering who I's mystery crush could be and contemplating whether he should just ask I directly about it. Kawashima quietly slurped her drink, looking much more relaxed and grounded now. Setting her empty glass down on the table, Kawashima agreed with what he had said. Clasping her hands together with a bright, hopeful smile, she declared that she absolutely could not afford to stop moving forward now. Looking directly at him with a beautiful, blushing smile, Kawashima warmly thanked him, causing Kimura to smile back in quiet satisfaction. Kimura expressed his relief at her change of heart as they prepared to leave the cafe, while Kawashima eagerly planned to buy a movie ticket in advance and invite I out after the school break. Kawashima immediately began to panic and daydream about accidentally touching hands while sharing popcorn at the cinema, prompting a sweat-dropping Kimura to suggest she use that moment to hold his hand. As they walked down the street, Kawashima excitedly wondered if she could use the date to ask I who his crush was, just as Kimura spotted their bus pulling up to the curb. Just as they were talking, I suddenly appeared out of nowhere and called out Kawashima's name. Kawashima was completely shocked and panicked as she realized her chance had arrived much sooner than expected. In a recap of her resolved plans, Kawashima imagined sharing popcorn at the cinema with I and accidentally touching his hand, with Kimura advising her to take full advantage of the moment to hold his hand. While Kawashima hoped she could ask Ai about his crush, Kimura resolved to create another opportunity for the two of them to be alone just as they spotted Ai walking by. Spotting them on the street, a surprised Ai asked if they were indeed Kawashima and Kimura. Kawashima and Kimura both froze in pure shock at his incredibly sudden and perfectly timed appearance. Chapter 5 began with Kawashima feeling incredibly flustered as she stood close to Ai, realizing that all of her careful preparation had led up to this exact moment. When Kawashima nervously remarked on the coincidence, Ai explained that Ai had sent him to run some errands, leaving Kimura to sweat over how Ai naturally acted like a magnet for convenient encounters. Kimura looked at Kawashima with deep worry, thinking that this encounter was far too sudden for her to be mentally prepared. Suddenly, Kawashima boldly pointed at Ai and invited him to grab some tea, completely shocking Kimura, who thought she sounded like a pickup artist. Ai casually agreed to the invitation, leaving an astounded Kimura to realize she had actually locked onto her target, as she turned around with a cool expression. Kawashima suddenly struck a dramatic pose and invited Kimura to join them, leaving him completely bewildered by her bizarre move. Kimura frantically leaned in and whispered that his presence was absolutely not needed on their date, making Kawashima gasp in surprise. Kawashima panickingly explained that jumping straight into a one-on-one date was too intimidating, so she wanted to start as a group outing before naturally transitioning, which Kimura realized was a brilliant strategy. Kimura felt incredibly proud of her overwhelming growth and foresight, completely unaware that she was simply terrified of being left alone without his support. Ai happily agreed to the group outing since he was starting to get hungry anyway, leaving a satisfied Kimura to join them as they walked down the street. As they walked, they immediately encountered a highly convenient donut food truck parked on the street. Kimura let out a silent yell of disbelief upon spotting a prominent sign offering 2 free donuts to any couple willing to hold hands. Kimura looked at Kawashima, remembering her intense panic from earlier and wondering if she could actually gather the courage to hold hands in this situation. Even though she claimed her resolve was complete, Kawashima took a highly stiff robotic step forward, making Kimura worry that the challenge was simply too difficult for her. With a dark, intense shadow over her face, Kawashima quietly whispered about the couple's discount. Reaching her hand out towards Ai, she coolly declared that if the donuts were free, she did not mind holding hands to get them. Ai was completely caught off guard, blushing furiously as his heart pounded in surprise. Kimura was amazed to see her actually putting his tsundere romantic comedy theory into practice, completely shocked as she successfully pulled off the bold approach. Kimura screamed internally in pure excitement, thinking that Kawashima was operating on a completely different level today. Kimura felt like she had completely flipped the dynamic, transitioning from the one being teased to a total teasing master. Suddenly, a firm grip locked onto Kimura's hand, causing him to freeze in sheer confusion as he realized Ai had grabbed his hand instead of Kawashima's. Ai sheepishly apologized, coolly remarking that his hand was probably sweaty, which left an incredibly frustrated Kimura screaming internally that Ai had just wasted a classic romantic line on him. Kimura loudly scolded Ai, demanding to know why he was holding a guy's hand when the sign clearly specified couples, and despaired over whether Ai was completely oblivious to Kawashima's bold approaches. An in-game battle prompt highlighted that Kawashima's romantic attack had not been very effective, leaving Kimura to lament the sheer near-impossible difficulty of dealing with an incredibly dense protagonist. Determined not to let the opportunity slip away, a heavily blushing Kawashima reached out and firmly grabbed Ai's other hand anyway. To cover up her intense embarrassment, Kawashima nervously asked the clerk if holding hands as a trio meant they could get 3 free donuts instead of 2. While Kimura was deeply impressed that she had so smoothly covered for them, Ai was left completely flustered with his heart pounding rapidly. Kimura wept tears of pure respect and applauded her quick thinking just as the 3 of them sat down to eat, with Ai offering Kawashima a bite of his donut. Kawashima jolted in surprise as Ai offered her a bite, prompting a shocked Kimura to realize the dense protagonist had just launched an unconscious romantic counterattack. Kimura grumbled about how unfair Ai's effortless, unconscious flirting was, while a highly flustered Kawashima nervously fidgeted with her skirt as she realized what sharing a bite meant. Just as Kawashima began to panic over the thought of an indirect kiss, Ai suddenly realized what he was doing and quickly apologized, explaining It was just a habit from sharing food with his little sister. A blush completely took over Ai's face as he covered his mouth, nervously stammering that he had absolutely not meant it in any suggestive way. Kimura stared in disbelief, amazed that Kawashima had successfully turned the tables and completely flustered Ai. Kimura was astounded that she had woven her own shyness into her approach, thinking it was a straight-up main heroine move. Kimura celebrated her incredible character growth as Ai suddenly stood up and stammered that he was feeling feverish, which Kawashima quickly questioned. Kawashima leaned in close to touch Ai's forehead to check his temperature, triggering a second wave of intense panic that made his head steam. Declaring that he would feel terrible if he passed any sickness to her, Ai suddenly bolted and wobbled away toward home, leaving Kawashima to watch him go in concern. Kimura loudly celebrated that Ai had been completely overwhelmed, triumphantly declaring that Kawashima was no longer playing the role of a losing heroine. Kimura proudly pictured her as a newly reborn winning heroine, radiating sheer confidence. Kimura applauded her performance and addressed her with deep respect, but Kawashima blushed at his sudden formality before looking down seriously. Kawashima turned to Kimura and declared that since he was the one who pushed her forward, she had made a firm decision about what to do next regardless of who Ai liked. She pointed directly at Kimura, confidently stating that she was going to go all out to win Ai over and instructing Kimura to simply sit back and watch her. Kimura smiled warmly and suggested that she say those bold words to Ai instead of him, causing her to instantly turn away in deep embarrassment. Later that evening, the sound of running water echoed through Kawashima's house as she took a hot shower. Standing under the warm water, Kawashima smiled as she reflected on how fun her day had been, specifically remembering the shocked expression Kimura made when she leaned in to kiss him. She giggled to herself as she stepped into the bathtub, recalling how hilarious Kimura's face had looked when she held hands with Ai. Soaking in the hot water, she contentedly noted that she had also gotten to spend some time hanging out with Ai. As water dripped from her chin, she quietly sat in the peaceful warmth of the bath. Suddenly, a massive blush rushed to her face as her eyes widened in realization at something she had not expected. With her heart pounding rapidly, she desperately wondered why she was suddenly obsessing over Kimura instead of Ai. She sank deeper into the tub, holding her face in distress, as she wondered why, despite finally hanging out with Ai, her mind was completely filled with memories of Kimura. Holding her burning cheeks as her heart raced, she realized with absolute shock that she could only think about Kimura. Kawashima walked down the school hallway toward Class 1B, deeply flustered and questioning why she could not stop thinking about Kimura, despite having spent the previous day hanging out with Ai, when Kimura suddenly startled her with a morning greeting. Kawashima blushed, deeply nervously stammering a good morning back to him. While Kawashima frantically tried to calm her racing heart, Kimura stared back at her with a serious and earnest expression. Completely overwhelmed by her chaotic thoughts, Kawashima slumped over her desk as steam figuratively rose from her head, prompting a nearby Takabe to watch her in concern. Chapter 6 of their story began with a focus on whether a flushed face was a sign of love or actual sickness, introducing Takabe's determination to step in and help. Takabe approached Kawashima in the classroom and directly asked her if she knew the proper way to bring down a fever. Assuming Takabe was talking about her own flustered face, a panicked Kawashima instantly denied having a fever. Takabe clarified that she was not referring to Kawashima, explaining instead that Ai had caught a cold and stayed home from school today. Kawashima let out a massive sigh of relief, glad that her intense embarrassment had not been discovered. Takabe admitted that she did not know how to care for someone who was sick at home and was hoping Kawashima could teach her, to which Kawashima quietly agreed. Kawashima suddenly recalled Ai shivering and admitting to feeling feverish the day before realizing that his condition had actually worsened. Kawashima panicked in her seat, realizing Ai's sickness was likely her fault because of how much she had flustered him with her touch and sudden approaches. Desperate to make amends, Kawashima eagerly offered to show Takabe exactly how to nurse him back to health, much to Takabe's surprise. Takabe smiled brightly and called her a lifesaver, causing Kawashima's heart to pound rapidly as she took in the gratitude. Kawashima sat down and began to walk Takabe through the steps of home nursing. She explained that the first step was to wipe away the patient's sweat, imagining Takabe performing the task on Ai, while Kimura watched the hypothetical scenario in intense thought. Kawashima added that the next step was to help the patient change out of their damp clothes, envisioning Takabe undressing Ai while Kimura sweat nervously in her imagination. Kawashima continued her explanation, suggesting that the next step was to check the patient's temperature while imagining herself leaning in close to Ai, which made her imaginary Kimura sweat in exasperation. Kawashima proudly recommended making rice porridge for the patient, which Takabe diligently noted down, while Kimura mentally screamed in panic at how easily Kawashima was giving away her best romantic strategy. Kimura pulled Kawashima aside and whispered intensely that she should not be giving a winning heroine such useful advice, causing a startled Kawashima to ask what was wrong. When Kimura suggested that taking Ai to the hospital would be the safest option, Takabe crossed her arms and explained that Ai would refuse to go because of the medical costs. Takabe admitted that she had no experience taking care of a sick person either, but she suddenly had an idea and called out to both Kimura and Kawashima. Takabe suggested they perform a practice demonstration, first forcing a highly reluctant Kimura to sit down and act as the patient. Takabe sharply pointed out that Kimura had acted like an expert by interrupting their conversation, while a heavily blushing Kawashima stepped forward with a towel to demonstrate how to wipe away sweat. Trembling and blushing intensely, Kawashima explained that the procedure had to be done carefully as she approached Kimura with the towel. When Kawashima leaned in far too close to explain how to wipe under the arms, a panicking Kimura pushed himself back and yelled at her to give him some space. With completely dazed eyes, Kawashima reached out and touched his chest to demonstrate, prompting a highly flustered Kimura to shout again that she was too close. Overwhelmed by her own embarrassment, Kawashima suddenly fell backward onto the floor, leaving a startled Kimura to ask what was wrong. Weakly raising her hand from the floor, Kawashima told Takabe that it was now her turn to practice, prompting a panicking Kimura to frantically wave his hands to stop a flustered Takabe from approaching. Takabe's eyes began to swirl as she repetitively muttered Kawashima's instructions, slowly marching toward Kimura while he desperately begged her to calm down. Takabe leaned in incredibly close to him, completely invading his personal space, as a sweating Kimura yelled at her to hold on. Swirl-eyed and determined, Takabe reached around his back to continue her demonstration, prompting a highly uncomfortable Kimura to shout in protest. Takabe pressed herself against him as she reached around to wipe his back, innocently asking if she was doing the procedure correctly. Kimura turned red and screamed a refusal in absolute panic, leaning away as far as he possibly could. Takabe demanded to know what the problem was, but a completely flustered Kimura begged her to just back off and give him some room. Telling him he was far too noisy for a patient, Takabe firmly pressed the towel against his skin to make him behave, while Kimura argued that his cooperative behavior was not the issue. While Takabe continued her aggressive demonstration on a struggling Kimura, Kawashima watched the interaction from behind, looking on in quiet somber jealousy. Kawashima suddenly stepped between them and pushed them apart, breaking up their close interaction. Blushing heavily and looking dead serious, Kawashima stated that she thought the two of them were getting a bit too close. While Takabe looked taken aback by the accusation and Kawashima growled in frustration, a highly relieved Kimura eagerly agreed with Kawashima. Takabe slumped into a state of gloom, quietly muttering that she could not even manage to perform a simple task like that properly. Takabe expressed her dejection over not being able to help Ai despite him always helping her, prompting a sympathetic Kawashima to call out her name. Looking down at the towel, Takabe felt a quiet pang of sadness, realizing how much she truly wanted to be of help to Ai. Kimura sat up and gently reassured Takabe that simply having the sincere desire to help her friend was more than enough. Kimura warned her that getting too close might cause her to catch Ai's cold, advising Takabe to make sure she looked after her own health as well. Takabe looked up defensively and started to argue back, determined to push through. Kimura continued warmly praising her for trying her best to practice nursing despite her inexperience, and calling her the best fiancée anyone could ask for, which made Takabe wide-eyed and flustered. Offering her a gentle smile, Kimura added that if it were him, he would have already fallen for her. Takabe jolted backward in absolute shock, her face turning bright red as she struggled to find her voice. Takabe covered her face in extreme embarrassment, completely overwhelmed by his words, while a highly annoyed Kawashima glared at Kimura from the background. Still blushing, Takabe insisted that she could not just leave Ai alone with a fever before quickly stealing her resolve. Kimura suddenly slammed his fist against his chest and loudly took charge of the situation, startling a Chibai Kawashima. Kimura offered to accompany Takabe to her house to take care of Ai together, promising to teach her everything she needed to know, which left both girls completely stunned. Takabe stared at him in silent awe, her eyes sparkling as she took in his dependable nature. Smiling softly with a warm blush, she quietly remarked on just how dependable he truly was. Kawashima grew highly annoyed and frantically intervened, pointing out in a panic that going over meant he would end up staying the night. Kimura calmly told her to relax, causing a startled Kawashima to blink in surprise. Kimura firmly vowed to prevent Ai and Takabe from turning the sick visit into a major romantic milestone, while Kawashima frantically pointed out that was not what she was talking about at all. Overwhelmed with embarrassment, Kawashima shouted in fierce determination that she was going as well. Kawashima loudly announced to the group that she was coming along to help take care of Ai as well, catching both Takabe and Kimura by surprise. While Takabe and Kimura stared in surprise at her sudden motivation, Kawashima steeled her resolve with a quiet pat to her chest. Kimura smugly whispered to Kawashima that they would use the group's sick visit to pile up multiple romantic flags at once, and a sweating Kawashima weakly agreed. Kimura enthusiastically raised his fist and led the charge toward Ai's house to begin their caretaking mission, with the girls following behind him. Kimura narrowed his eyes with fierce determination, firmly resolving to disrupt the typical flow of the sick visit event. He calculated that by placing Kawashima in charge of Ai's care, he could block Takabe's screen time and achieve two goals with a single stroke. Kimura proudly marched ahead, declaring that he would turn this event into absolute peak fiction, while Kawashima and Takabe followed behind him in mild annoyance. Chapter 7 began with a focus on preventing the ultimate caretaking cliché, depicted by Takabe blushingly holding out a spoon of porridge, while Kimura panicked in the background. Upon arriving at Ai's residence, Kimura was completely astonished to see that the main character lived in a massive modern mansion. Takabe casually explained that the house was actually owned by her father, who rented it out, prompting a shocked Kimura to realize she was incredibly wealthy. Inside the house, Ai lay in bed, flushed and sweating, groaning softly from his high fever. Kawashima leaned over the bed to anxiously ask if he was okay, causing Ai to weakly open his eyes and say her name in surprise. Kimura quickly handed Kawashima a bag of instant rice porridge, instructing her to go heat it up in the kitchen so she could be the one to serve him. Takabe rolled up her sleeves and declared she would help cook too, but her clueless suggestion about microwaving an egg made Kimura sweat in sudden alarm. A sudden massive explosion instantly rocked the kitchen. Kimura furiously yelled at Takabe for pulling such a cliché bad cook heroine stunt, while a completely stunned Takabe stood amidst the rising black smoke trying to apologize. Takabe looked down with a heavy blush and quietly offered a sincere apology for her kitchen disaster, while Kimura gulped nervously. Kimura's sweat dropped and gently reassured her that everyone makes mistakes, telling Kawashima that he would take care of cleaning up the messy kitchen. Turning his attention back to Kawashima, Kimura reached out and handed her a spoon. Kimura instructed Kawashima to go feed Ai the porridge and even wipe down his body afterward if she could manage it. Kawashima panicked and frantically waved her hands, arguing that wiping his body was far too sudden, while Kimura pushed her to go ahead anyway despite her protests. Kimura aggressively urged her to proceed, reminding her she had come all this way specifically to establish a romantic flag, before suddenly grabbing her hand. Completely overwhelmed, Kawashima suddenly blurted out that she had to run an errand for her mother and bolted out of the room, leaving a stunned Kimura shouting after her. Kimura stood there sweating and completely dumbfounded that she had actually chickened out and fled the house. Running down the street with a burning blush, Kawashima realized she could not face Ai while she was still so thoroughly confused about her feelings for Kimura. Takabe returned to the room and asked if Kawashima had gone home, and Kimura confirmed it before instructing Takabe that she would have to feed Ai the porridge instead. Kimura additionally asked Takabe to prepare a wet towel to help soothe Ai's fever, and she quickly agreed to do so. Sitting by the bed, Kimura fed Ai a spoonful of porridge, but in his feverish daze, Ai weakly mumbled his thanks while completely mistaking Kimura for Kawashima. Kimura was initially shocked by the mistake, but his face quickly twisted into a highly mischievous grin as he realized he could use this feverish delusion to his advantage. Deciding to play along with everything he had, Kimura adopted a ridiculous high-pitched falsetto voice to feed Ai, leaving a deadpan Takabe to watch the bizarre display from the doorway in sheer annoyance. Takabe handed over the wet towel and asked if she could just watch from the doorway, which Kimura casually permitted. When Kimura lifted Ai's shirt to wipe down his body, Takabe caught a glimpse of Ai's bare chest, let out a loud squeal, and spun around in absolute embarrassment. Takabe flustredly accused him of being indecent, but Kimura argued back that he had to remove the shirt to wipe Ai's sweat, telling her to simply keep her back turned. Now wiped clean and resting with a cool patch on his forehead, Ai finally drifted off into a quiet, peaceful sleep. Takabe quietly asked if Ai would recover, and after Kimura reassured her that he would, she let out a deep, relieved sigh. Kimura deadpanned that he could never tell if she and Ai actually got along, prompting a defensive Takabe to blush and tell him not to get any ideas just because she felt relieved. Takabe defensively yelled that she only wanted Ai to recover, because she would miss her meals if he remained sick, denying that she actually cared about his well-being, while Kimura dismissed her remarks with a sigh. Kimura admitted he was glad to see her back to her usual sharp self, since her shy version felt unnatural, which instantly flustered her and made her scream in embarrassment. Watching her quiet down into a gloomy expression, Kimura pondered how these sudden vulnerable sides of a person could unexpectedly push a relationship forward. Takabe asked Kimura if he was going to stay over for the night, and Kimura calmly confirmed that he was. Kimura asked if her parents ever worried about a boy and a girl living together under the same roof despite their engagement, but Takabe quietly replied that they did not. Takabe stated that her father probably did not care about the arrangement at all, prompting Kimura to ask about her mother. Takabe calmly revealed that her mother had already passed away, causing a sweating Kimura to quickly apologize for bringing up the subject. Reassuring him that it had happened when she was just a young child, Takabe had a memory of her mother singing lullabies to her whenever she had a fever. Takabe sat down on the edge of Ai's bed to demonstrate how her mother used to comfort her. Takabe softly began to sing the lullaby in a gentle voice, which left Kimura completely stunned by how beautifully she sang. As Takabe continued to sing, and Ai slept peacefully, Kimura panicked internally, fearing that the romantic atmosphere was reaching a critical peak that would trigger a massive development. Sensing the impending danger of a romantic flag, Kimura suddenly yelled her name to interrupt the moment. With a completely serious expression, Kimura offered to sing the lullaby himself, leaving a thoroughly shocked Takabe to demand why he would do such a thing. Kimura claimed that he was simply in the mood to sing, causing Takabe to groan in annoyance, while a weakly awake Ai grumbled from under the sheets. Undeterred, Kimura began to awkwardly sing the next verse of the lullaby to Ai. Closing his eyes, Kimura continued to sing the lullaby in a flat, monotone voice. Takabe chuckled softly at his terrible singing and joined back in gently continuing the next line of the song. She sang the lines of gratitude for the tiny spark, fondly remembering her mother holding and comforting her during her childhood fevers. Takabe looked down with a soft, deeply emotional expression as she hummed the melody. Leaning her head gently beside the bed, Takabe closed her eyes and quietly mumbled a soft thought of her mother. Kimura quietly remarked that he had not expected her mother to have passed away, and asked why her father had arranged an engagement between her and Ai, only to realize she was not responding. Kimura leaned in closer and realized that she had completely fallen asleep right there. Observing her sleep, Kimura decided that he would need to look into the mystery of her arranged engagement soon, purely for Kawashima's sake. Takabe suddenly snapped awake to the sound of birds chirping outside, panicking as she realized she had slept through the entire night. Takabe looked over and saw that Ai was resting peacefully while Kimura lay fast asleep right beside the bed. Looking at his tired face, she realized that Kimura had indeed stayed awake, taking care of Ai for the entire night. She gently draped a blanket over his shoulders to keep him warm as he slept. Smiling softly with a gentle blush, she quietly thought to herself what a strange but kind guy he was. Ai slowly woke up and stretched happily, noting that his fever had broke and he felt much better than the day before. Ai was completely shocked to discover Kimura fast asleep right next to his bed and called out his name in surprise. I happily noted that his body even felt completely clean just as Takabe entered the room and remarked that he was finally awake. Blushing slightly, I asked Takabe if she was the one who had stayed up to nurse him back to health. Takabe bluntly replied that she had not done it, explaining that Kimura was the one who cared for him and even sang him lullabies, which left I completely horrified and sweat dropping. I stared at the sleeping Kimura in quiet shock, deeply moved to realize just how far his classmate had gone to nurse him. Entirely misinterpreting Kimura's dedication, a heavily blushing I concluded that Kimura must have genuine romantic feelings for him. Meanwhile, a completely oblivious Kimura simply groaned softly in his sleep. Back at school by the lockers, Kimura greeted Kawashima, causing her to instantly jolt in surprise with a heavy blush. Kawashima slammed her locker shut, yelled a frantic morning greeting, and bolted down the hall, leaving a confused Kimura to note that she was acting strangely distant. Chapter 8 of their journey began with a deep desire to understand Kawashima's true feelings as she stood nervously between I and Kimura. As Kawashima floated quickly away down the school corridor, Kimura watched her go, sweating and wondering if he had done something wrong. Kimura tried to approach her and call her name again, but Kawashima instantly snapped her head away and marched past him in a fluster. Kimura took a step to follow her, but Kawashima sped away down the hallway as fast as possible to avoid him. Kimura stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, wondering if she was avoiding him, until Takabe arrived carrying a stack of books and bluntly told him he was in the way. Kimura asked Takabe about the massive stack of books she was carrying, and she explained that the teacher had dumped the chore on her. Takabe admitted she originally planned to make I carry them, but handed the books to Kimura instead, making Kimura realize with a sweat that he had accidentally broken another classic romantic comedy flag. To salvage the situation and keep Takabe away from I, Kimura enthusiastically declared that he would love to carry them, leaving Takabe flustered and confused by his eager response. As they headed toward the information room, Takabe asked Kimura directly if Kawashima was currently avoiding him. Takabe pointed out that she would not know Kawashima's reasons, suggesting Kimura might have done something insensitive since he did not exactly seem like the delicate type, which Kimura found rather harsh. Takabe hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling slightly as she held a book on the shelf. Blushing deeply, Takabe pointed out that he had a habit of suddenly grabbing other people's hands out of nowhere, leaving a deadpan Kimura completely confused. Takabe yelled that his cluelessness was exactly what she meant, completely unaware that Kawashima was quietly peering into the room and watching them talk in flustered suspicion. Kawashima stood outside with swirling eyes, feeling intensely frustrated and questioning why she was reacting so strongly to seeing them together. Inside the stuffy room, Takabe fanned her collar and complained about the heat taking off her jacket. Kimura watched her sweating as he realized that if she had been locked in this hot room alone with I, it would have triggered a major romantic flag. He pictured the exact cliché scenario of I accidentally tripping and landing on Takabe in the heat, convinced that is exactly how the scene would have played out. Suddenly, Takabe spotted a cockroach on a nearby cabinet, shrieked in terror, and grabbed Kimura's shirt from behind. She pressed herself tightly against Kimura's back in sheer panic, crying out that she could not handle bugs, while a sweating Kimura struggled to get her to let go in the heat. Peering through the crack in the door, Kawashima went completely red-faced and horrified as she watched Takabe clinging tightly to Kimura's back. Kawashima gasped in absolute shock, unable to believe her own eyes at what she was witnessing through the door crack. Kawashima became deeply flustered, imagining that Takabe and Kimura had secretly developed a flirtatious relationship behind her back. Inside the room, Takabe demanded that Kimura deal with the bug because he was a guy, while a terrified Kimura argued that her views were outdated and that he hated bugs just as much as she did. Kimura checked the cabinet and told Takabe that the insect had already crawled away, but she suddenly jolted in terror at the thought of it still being nearby. Panicking that the bug was still around, Takabe clutched Kimura tightly, causing them both to lose their balance and crash to the floor. Kawashima tried to convince herself that Kimura would never be involved in such an intimate accident, yet she could not stop peeking into the room with growing suspicion. Peering through the door, Kawashima saw Takabe sprawled directly on top of Kimura on the floor, surrounded by fallen books. Unable to contain herself, Kawashima slammed the door open and loudly demanded to know what they were doing on the floor. Caught completely off guard, both Takabe and Kimura yelled her name in pure shock. Kimura and Takabe stood up and asked in confusion what exactly she thought they were doing, leaving a flustered Kawashima to stutter silently. Blushing furiously, Kawashima waved her hands and frantically claimed that she did not mean anything by it and that it was all just a misunderstanding. Takabe decided to leave the room, glancing back at them and remarking that it looked like Kawashima had something private to discuss with Kimura anyway. Once they were left alone, an awkward silence settled over the room as a sweating Kimura stared at Kawashima while she looked down with a heavy blush. Kimura directly asked her why she had been avoiding him lately, prompting a highly defensive Kawashima to panic shout that she was doing no such thing. Kimura insisted that she was avoiding him at that very moment, leaving a flustered Kawashima clutching her chest as she struggled to form a response. Squeezing her eyes shut in embarrassment, Kawashima finally began to speak. With her heart pounding rapidly in her chest, she blushing mud-red confessed that she could not stop thinking about him. Kimura stood frozen in absolute disbelief for a moment before letting out a loud, bewildered scream of shock. Blushing deeply, she explained that ever since their practice date, she had felt strange because she kept thinking about him even when she was supposed to be enjoying her time with Ai. As Kawashima anxiously wondered if she had fallen in love with him, a panicked Kimura raised his hands and desperately shouted her name to stop her before she could finish her sentence. In the quiet information room, Kimura bowed deeply and respectfully before Kawashima. Blushing softly, Kawashima called his name in quiet confusion. Sweating nervously, Kimura hesitated for a moment before finally opening his mouth to speak. Kimura was completely stunned by her confession, silently questioning how it was even possible for Kawashima to have feelings for him. He recalled all the moments they had spent together, with her bright smiles flashing through his mind. Kimura firmly stated to her that what she was feeling was not actually love. Bowing his head, Kimura repeated his assertion that her feelings were not true romantic love. Kimura explained that she was simply feeling grateful because he had helped her, comparing her confusion to the D-goal effect, or the suspension bridge effect, leaving Kawashima thoroughly bewildered. Kimura elaborated that working toward a common goal naturally brought people closer, advising her not to mistake that simple closeness for something else. Kimura turned away and reminded her that the person she truly loved was Ai, pointing out that she had spent so much time with him. He loudly warned her that falling for people so easily would only cause her to end up as a background character, making Kawashima gasp in surprise. Walking away down the aisle of shelves, Kimura quietly reiterated one last time that whatever she was feeling was definitely not love. He looked back over his shoulder with a gentle smile, asking what good could possibly come from falling in love with someone like him. Kawashima stood in stunned silence, her eyes wide as his parting words echoed deeply within her. Kimura gently reminded her that she still had Ai, and a flustered Kawashima quietly agreed. The door suddenly opened as Ai walked in and greeted them both, prompting a startled shout from Kawashima. Ai explained that a teacher had mentioned there was something important in the materials brought over earlier, while Kimura began searching through the boxes of books in the background. Kimura sifted through the stack of materials, searching for the specific items the teacher had requested. While Kimura successfully found the documents, Kawashima clutched her pounding chest in distress, trying to convince herself that Kimura was right even though her heart would not stop racing. With swirling eyes and her heart pounding intensely, Kawashima desperately wondered how she could possibly explain her body's overwhelming reaction to both Kimura and Ai. Suddenly, Ai tripped and fell directly on top of Kimura, creating an accidental compromising pile up on the floor while a blushing Kawashima watched in shock. Kimura rubbed his head and told Ai to watch where he was going, prompting Ai to frantically apologize while a silent Kawashima stared in deep, internal conflict. Ai blushed deeply and hid his face, repeatedly apologizing for the clumsy accident. Kawashima's heart pounded furiously as she stood completely frozen in embarrassment. Looking down, she suddenly realized the true nature of everything that had been happening. While Ai picked up the fallen books and Kimura watched him, Kawashima struggled to process her realization. She recalled the moment Ai had tightly gripped Kimura's hand. She thought about Ai falling directly on top of Kimura. Completely overwhelmed, Kawashima held her cheeks as her mind swirled with confusion, wondering if she was actually getting excited by the interactions between Ai and Kimura. She realized that her intense frustration at seeing Takabe and Kimura together was because of a completely unexpected misunderstanding. In her total confusion, Kawashima wondered if she was actually upset because their close interactions threatened to sink her imaginary romantic pairing between Ai and Kimura. Kawashima suddenly ran up waving her hands in a panic and desperately told Kimura to completely forget everything she had confessed earlier, leaving him utterly baffled. Blushing deeply, Kawashima happily declared that he and I were exceptionally close, causing Kimura to gasp in confusion. Waving a cheerful farewell, Kawashima ran out of the room, leaving a completely deadpan Kimura to sweat and wonder why their conversation had taken such a bizarre turn. Kimura looked down thoughtfully, still plagued by her earlier confession about not being able to stop thinking about him. Scratching his head as he looked out the window, Kimura questioned what he was even getting his hopes up for, unable to truly make sense of her chaotic feelings. On another school day, a cramped enclosed gym storage room stood nearby, serving as a classic hotspot for accidental romantic comedy developments. Kimura seriously reflected on how perfect it would be to trap Ai and Kawashima together inside, though he lamented that boys and girls had separate PE classes. Chapter 9 began with the dramatic premise of escaping the gym storage room, depicting Ai accidentally looming over a flustered Takabe on the floor while Kimura watched in horror through the door. As Ai stretched in relief that class was finally over, the teacher quickly ordered him to go put the sports balls away. Ai complained about being singled out, but the teacher insisted he do it anyway, making a sweating Kimura realize that such forced pushiness was a clear sign of an impending romantic comedy event. Kimura noticed someone was already inside the gym storage room and turned around sweating as he frantically wondered if the person waiting there was Takabe or Kawashima. Using his sharp vision, Kimura was shocked to discover that Takabe was the one inside the storage room putting the equipment away. Kimura panicked as he envisioned Ai and Takabe getting locked inside the cramped, stuffy room together, convinced it would inevitably trigger a highly intimate and flustering event. Determined to break this romantic flag for Kawashima's sake, Kimura raised his hand and loudly called out to the teacher. Kimura gritted his teeth and passionately volunteered to do the chore himself, causing the sweat-dropping teacher to agree that either of them would be fine. Ai was deeply touched and offered his sincere thanks with a pounding heart, while Kimura smiled in quiet satisfaction at having successfully neutralized the storage room trap. When Kimura opened the storage room door, Takabe was surprised to see him and remarked on it, while Kimura admitted he had expected Kawashima to be doing the chore, before Takabe explained that she was outside handling other equipment. Kimura sweat dropped in frustration at how easily Kawashima had missed another prime romantic opportunity, while a completely dazed Kawashima happily went about her work outside. While Kimura consoled himself that the romantic flag was at least broken, a loud snap echoed outside as a large tree branch suddenly broke off and crashed down with a heavy thud. Inside the storage room, both Kimura and Takabe turned their heads toward the door in startled silence. Their eyes widened in sudden alarm as they realized the door had jammed shut. They frantically pulled on the door handles to find that the door was completely jammed, and a horrified Kimura looked through the window to see the fallen branch wedged tightly against the handle outside. They stood side by side in completely defeated silence, forced to accept the fact that they were locked inside. Kimura silently accepted that the romantic comedy laws of their world had insisted on a cliché lock-in event, though he felt relieved that I was not the one trapped with her. Kimura sat down on a vaulting box and suggested they simply wait for rescue, but a dejected Takabe pointed out that it was already lunchtime, prompting Kimura to ask if she was hungry. While Kimura indifferently muttered that his stomach was fine, an increasingly frustrated Takabe pointed directly at him and aggressively demanded his help to force the door open. Takabe urgently shouted that they had no time to waste, while a sweating Kimura was suddenly struck by an ominous realization about what her urgency meant. Kimura sweat dropped and asked her if she simply needed to use the bathroom, but a deeply offended Takabe loudly denied it. While Kimura quietly wondered if her panic was over the school cafeteria selling out of food, Takabe desperately banged on the locked door and yelled for someone to open it. Kimura advised that they should simply relax and wait for fifth period, since the door would not open until someone helped them, prompting a deadpan Takabe to note how surprisingly calm he was. Takabe suddenly spotted something and pointed up, telling Kimura to look over toward the wall. Takabe suggested climbing onto his shoulders to escape through a high window, but Kimura immediately raised his hands and refused her plan. Kimura explained his refusal by imagining her getting stuck in the small window, which offended Takabe as she angrily asked if he was implying she was fat. Exasperated by his response, Takabe loudly declared that she would do it herself anyway. Takabe suddenly flipped the plan by lifting Kimura onto her shoulders, prompting a shocked Kimura to praise her strength, while pointing out that the high window had iron bars and confirming that the fallen branch was indeed blocking the door outside. Determined to escape, Takabe stubbornly announced that she would push him through the bars anyway. Kimura panicked and screamed that the bars were in the way as she forcefully shoved him against the narrow window frame anyway. Takabe ignored his protests entirely, aggressively shouting encouragement as she continued to push him. Kimura screamed in agony that he was going to be squeezed through the bars like jelly as she pushed him with all her might. Forced to admit defeat, they sat on the floor together, and a bruised Kimura weakly suggested they should just wait until fifth period for help. Takabe looked down quietly and confessed that she had made an important promise. She explained that she had promised Kawashima they would eat lunch together today. Kimura asked if she could simply reschedule and eat with her the next day, but Takabe flatly refused. With a deeply vulnerable expression, Takabe explained that Kawashima was the very first friend she had ever managed to make, which took Kimura by surprise. Takabe confessed that she had no other friends because her extreme physical strength during sports classes usually scared everyone else away. She fondly added that Kawashima was the only person who had ever treated her like a normal, genuine friend. Clutching her arms tightly, she quietly concluded that was why she was so desperate to keep her promise to her first friend. Kimura listened in quiet surprise, looking down thoughtfully as she finished speaking. Kimura walked past her and instructed her to step back, leaving Takabe confused. Kimura reached out and grabbed a wooden baseball bat from the corner, prompting a surprised Takabe to ask what he was planning to do. Gritting his teeth, Kimura swung the wooden bat with full force directly at the door's window. The window shattered violently into pieces under the heavy blow, allowing Kimura to reach out and clear the branch, opening the door so he could tell Takabe to go. Takabe stared at him in complete awe before stepping through the doorway and offering her sincere thanks. Watching Takabe reunite with Kawashima on the stairs, Kimura placed the bat over his shoulder and sighed that he would have to write another reflection essay for breaking school property. The afternoon sky slowly shifted as the school day continued. Inside the quiet classroom, Kimura stood at his desk writing his reflection essay. A student suddenly approached and pulled up a chair to sit down right next to him. Takabe looked at him expectantly, prompting a sweat-dropping Kimura to ask if he could help her. Takabe casually sat down and picked up a pen, declaring that she would help write the reflection essay as well, which caught him completely off guard. Kimura insisted he could handle the writing himself, but Takabe argued back that she was the one who had demanded they leave the room in the first place. Leaning down over the paper, Takabe seriously added that there was something she had come all that way to tell him. She softly began to explain that the lunch she had with Kawashima was highly important to her. Looking at him with a warm smile, she happily told him that the lunch had been truly delicious, making Kimura smile in gentle relief. Kimura warmly replied that he was glad to hear it as the afternoon progressed outside. In the school hallway, Kawashima carried a massive stack of boxes when I suddenly approached her and called her name. I smiled as he explained there was a student council task that involved planting flowers around the school. I mentioned her knowledge of flowers and asked if she was free to help him right now, leaving Kawashima completely frozen and sweating. Kawashima tearfully explained that she could not go because she had to finish a massive stack of remedial worksheets. Kimura yelled in utter frustration at her bad timing, demanding to know why she had to do schoolwork at such a crucial moment, while Kawashima wailed in despair. Chapter 10 of their story began with Kawashima's determination to finish her schoolwork, depicted by her looking up sweetly while holding a potted flower. While Kawashima weakly tried to protest, Kimura yelled that the flower planting task would have been the perfect peak romantic event for her. Kimura insisted they could still catch the event if they hurried, imagining a cozy scenario of Kawashima happily planting flowers alongside I. Kimura offered to help her with the worksheets to speed things up, and although a highly flustered Kawashima tried to refuse out of guilt, he firmly insisted on assisting. Kimura seriously explained that he had already made up his mind to support her, leaving a heavily blushing Kawashima to stare up at him in silent awe. settled down at their desks, Kimura pointed out that he was merely assisting, and she still had to solve the problems herself, which she meekly accepted. The classroom clock ticked away in the silent room as the afternoon steadily passed by. Kimura announced they were finally finished, with a completely exhausted Kawashima slumping face down onto her desk while he gathered the massive stack to carry to the teacher. Kimura turned back to tell her to quickly run over to Ai now that the work was done. Kawashima suddenly slammed another massive stack of papers onto her desk, weakly admitting that they had only completed half of the workload, which left Kimura completely horrified. Kimura yelled in disbelief, demanding to know why she had not told him sooner, while a tearful Kawashima apologized and explained there had not been a good moment to bring it up. Kimura panicked as he realized the sun would set before they could finish, frantically racking his brain for another way to resolve the situation. Takabe suddenly entered the classroom and stood before them, asking what they were up to. Kawashima explained they were working on remedial worksheets, prompting Takabe to confidently place her hands on her hips and bluntly declare that they were wasting their time. Kawashima weakly tried to object, while Takabe looked at a sweating Kimura and pointed out that he was the one doing all the heavy lifting. Looking incredibly serious, Kimura firmly replied that there was a goal he wanted Kawashima to achieve, even if it meant he had to do everything in his power to help her. Takabe stared at Kimura, thoughtfully, quietly absorbing his earnest words. Takabe suddenly pulled up a chair to help them with the worksheets, leaving a startled Kawashima to ask why she was joining in. Takabe urged them to hurry and finish the work, so Kawashima could prioritize what she really wanted to do, prompting an incredibly grateful Kawashima to clasp her hands in thanks. Kimura grinned triumphantly as he realized Takabe had joined their side to speed up the process, confident that they could now easily clear the hurdles. Just then, Ai approached them, prompting Chibai Takabe to ask what he was doing there, to which Ai replied that he had something to tell Kawashima. Ai explained that he had already finished the entire flower planting job by himself, causing Kimura to scream in absolute jaw-dropped horror. Kimura despaired over the sad image of the main character planting all the flowers by himself, wondering if it was even acceptable for a romantic comedy protagonist to end up so isolated. Kimura panicked as he realized how much time had passed, but quickly resolved to salvaging the situation by aiming for the classic walking home together event instead. Determined to keep Ai at school, Kimura shoved a stack of folders toward him and loudly demanded his help, which a surprised Ai hesitantly agreed to do. Ai questioned if all of the worksheets belonged to Kawashima, while Takabe asked if they were really so urgent, leaving a sweating Kawashima unable to answer. Blushing deeply, Kawashima softly confessed that she had only wanted to help Ai, prompting a triumphant Kimura to celebrate that she had finally spoken up. Ai warmly smiled and told her she did not need to worry about such things, causing Kimura to wail in absolute despair that her confession had had no romantic effect. Takabe called Kimura a weird guy for voluntarily doing such tedious chores, leaving a frustrated Kimura to cry out that she understood absolutely nothing about his romantic comedy strategy. Ai explained that he wanted to help because he felt the work was ultimately for Kimura's sake as well, leaving a completely confused Kimura to ask why it concerned him. Ai weakly stammered his name and reminded him that Kimura had stayed up all night to take care of him when he was sick. With a heavy blush, Ai softly stated that he was helping out now as a way to repay his kindness. Ai stared at him with an incredibly intense gaze and declared that they were friends after all, to which Kimura offered a deadpan reply. Ai reacted with hesitant surprise to the word, prompting Kimura to firmly repeat that they were indeed friends. A highly flustered Ai recalled Kimura's earlier statement about liking him, but Kimura instantly shut down the thought and told him to completely forget it. Ai looked away in immense relief as he agreed they were friends, while Kawashima let out a warm chuckle as she watched the two boys interact. Kimura deadpanned and asked Kawashima what she was smiling about, telling her to get back to work, which left her flusteredly stammering. Kawashima quietly admitted that she felt a bit guilty seeing everyone gather in the classroom just to help her with her remedial worksheets. She warmly added that studying together like this was actually fun, looking thoughtfully at the group. With a radiant, blushing smile, Kawashima happily asked if they could already consider themselves friends. Takabe huffed and turned away with a blush to hide her embarrassment before she resumed her writing on the desk. Takabe leaned closer to inspect the desk, noticing that something had been carved directly into the wooden surface. I explained that he had carved his name with his friends on a desk back in middle school, prompting Takabe to thoughtfully note that friends often carved their names together. I added that they had been severely scolded afterward since the desk was school property, which startled Takabe. Shocked by I's words, Takabe suddenly brandished a box cutter and announced she had already carved her own name, prompting both Kimura and Kawashima to scream in panic as she prepared to make another cut. Takabe aggressively carved I's name next to hers, declaring that they would get in trouble together, leaving both I and Kimura to scream in absolute panic. Kimura panicked at the sight of their names side by side, realizing that this carving could actually establish a permanent winning flag for Takabe. Kimura and Takabe both dragged Kawashima forward to carve her name too, but Kawashima suddenly handed the cutter back to Kimura and told him to join in as well, catching him completely off guard. Kawashima told Kimura that he was getting dragged down with them, leaving a sweat-dropping Kimura with no choice but to accept the cutter. Kimura quickly carved Kawashima's name beneath the other two to complete the group of friends. The teacher suddenly opened the classroom door and announced that it was time for them to head home, while Kimura stood by nervously. The teacher instructed Kawashima to take her remaining worksheets home to finish, leaving her to bow in complete dejected defeat. As the four students nervously shuffled past him to exit the room, the teacher looked around suspiciously before gasping in shock at what was on the desk. The teacher inspected the desk and realized that they had freshly carved their names into the wood. The teacher thoughtfully stroked his chin, realizing there were only 3 names carved on the desk, despite 4 students having been in the room. While the group waved goodbye as they headed outside, Kawashima suddenly looked back and called out to Kimura, who stood frozen in pure dread as he held the box cutter. Kimura stared down at the box cutter in his hand, lost in a long, silent thought. The teacher suddenly slid the door open and announced it was time for them to head home, startling the students. Kimura looked at the desk with a quiet expression and gently placed the box cutter down, choosing not to carve his own name beside theirs. The wood surface remained with only the 3 names of the main trio freshly carved into it. Walking his bike out of the school gates, Kimura quietly thought to himself that it would have been lame to carve his own name alongside the main characters. With a highly determined and deeply blushing face, Kawashima thought to herself that she had finally realized something very important. Her mind spun with confusion as she convinced herself that her racing heart was actually caused by watching the close interactions between I and Kimura. Seeing them walk together outside the school, she determinedly dashed behind a pillar to spy on them, declaring to herself that she could not afford to miss a single moment of their interactions. Chapter 11 began with her focused investigation, depicting Kawashima peeking from behind a wall with blushing cheeks as she secretly monitored I and Kimura. Spotting them standing outside the gym storage shed, Kawashima creeped closer in flustered surprise, shocked that the 2 of them were heading inside together. Kimura thanked I for helping fix the broken door of the gym storage, and I casually replied that it was simply part of his duties as the student council vice president. I added that he was glad to help, while Kimura sweat dropped and pointed out that he was the one who had smashed the window in the first place. I smiled warmly and that Takabe had returned home looking incredibly happy the other day because she had successfully eaten lunch with a friend. I looked at him and thanked him for making it happen, but Kimura humbly replied that it was just a coincidence and he did not deserve the credit. I blushed slightly and softly admitted that seeing Takabe smile like that felt quite nice, prompting a silent deadpan groan from Kimura about the main character's typical oblivious nature. Overhearing their conversation, Kawashima gasped in sudden shock as she realized that her lunch date with Takabe had actually been arranged entirely by Kimura. Looking down with a warm, gentle smile, she felt deeply touched that Kimura had gone out of his way to help her yet again. She looked back on all the memories of their time together, deeply moved by how many times Kimura had quietly stepped in to protect her and save the day. Kimura casually asked I if he had watched the soccer match from the previous day, and I confirmed that he did. I began talking animatedly about the match's details and players, while Kawashima quietly peered at them from around a nearby corner. Kimura listened quietly as I continued his enthusiastic sports chatter. Watching them, Kawashima smiled softly and noted how comfortable Ai seemed when talking to Kimura, contrasting it with how polite and formal the two boys usually behaved around each other. Despite their casual conversation, she felt that the two boys still maintained a somewhat awkward distance between themselves. Kawashima realized she should not be eavesdropping and decided to head back, just as Ai groaned nearby about carrying a heavy load of books. Ai suddenly slid open the door with a loud clatter and let out a startled shout upon bumping directly into Kawashima, who jumped in surprise. Kawashima noticed Ai's hands were shaking and asked if he was all right, to which a flustered Ai weakly agreed. But her mind immediately replayed Ai's soft voice and translated it into a dramatic romantic plea not to leave his side. She covered her face in complete panic, her eyes swirling as she imagined Ai and Kimura holding hands and entering a forbidden romance, desperately wondering what she should do. Kimura suddenly banged his head against the wall, unable to listen to her wild delusions any longer. Turning around, a sweat-dropping Kimura peered into the hallway and asked aloud if someone was standing there. He looked down to find Kawashima completely collapsed face down on the floor in absolute exhaustion. When Kimura asked her what she was doing, panicked, Kawashima instantly leaped to her feet with a startled scream. Kawashima frantically apologized and tried to explain herself, completely overwhelmed with embarrassment as her mind continued to spin over her strange delusions. Apologizing for the interruption, Kawashima suddenly sprinted away at full speed, leaving a confused Kimura shouting after her. Running down the street, Kawashima cried in frustration, convinced she would never be able to become Ai's heroine at this rate. Back in the hallway, a sweat-dropping Kimura muttered in exasperation while Ai watched her run off in complete confusion. Ai mentioned that he had forgotten to thank Kawashima, prompting Kimura to ask why he needed to thank her. Ai recalled the time he was sick and nursed all night, assuming Kawashima had been the one who fed him the porridge, forcing a deadpan Kimura to sweat and confess that he was actually the one who had fed him. I hesitantly asked if Kimura's parents had been all right with him staying over, and after Kimura told him not to worry about it, I quietly shut the door and thoughtfully processed the revelation. I quietly looked down in deep thought. I quietly spoke up, grabbing his attention. Blushing heavily, I asked Kimura why he was being so nice to him. Kimura awkwardly explained that his actions were partly because of Kawashima. As Kimura walked away, he casually added that he also wondered why he did it, leaving a completely flustered Ai behind. I weakly smiled and offered his thanks after Kimura stated that he simply considered him a friend. Kimura slowly began to add more to his explanation. Kimura playfully added that he wanted to get to know Ai even deeper, causing Ai to jolt in complete horrified panic. When Kimura deadpanned and asked if that was a refusal, I frantically stammered that having him come on so strong was too much, especially since they were both guys, but Kimura casually dismissed the gender barrier entirely. Terrified by Kimura's teasing, I suddenly stood up and loudly announced that he already had someone he liked, catching Kimura completely off guard. Kimura instantly recognized this as his prime opportunity to discover Ai's crush and demanded to know who it was, but a blushing Ai looked away and refused to say her name. Overhearing Ai's soft admission that his crush resembled her, Kawashima held her face in sheer, overwhelmed embarrassment. Kimura stood in stunned silence for a brief moment before letting out a loud scream of pure utter shock. Completely overwhelmed by the sudden revelation, Kawashima screamed in pure panic and bolted away from the scene. Kimura stood outside the storage room, silently processing Ai's crucial confession that the girl he liked resembled Kawashima. Sweat dripped down Kimura's face as he slowly realized the massive implication behind Ai's statement. Kimura realized that saying his crush looked like Kawashima was practically a direct admission of his feelings for her, leaving him completely flabbergasted by the development. Kimura was completely exasperated, sweat dropping, as he questioned what on earth I could possibly mean by saying his crush merely resembled Kawashima. Kimura caught up to Ai and asked him to the rest of the story, and a slightly flustered Ai agreed to explain as they walked home together. Chapter 12 began with Kimura closing in on Ai's mystery crush, while Kawashima looked on from behind with confusion. Under the twilight sky, as crows called in the distance, Kimura walked his bike home alongside Ai on the quiet residential street. Ai recalled a girl he used to play with at the park when he was 8 years old, prompting an instantly shocked Kimura to internally scream that the girl was undoubtedly Kawashima. I added that the girl had been incredibly kind to everyone, making a sweating Kimura even more certain of her identity. I continued that she always had a very cute smile which only heightened Kimura's internal panic. When I mentioned that she always wore pigtails, a sweating Kimura was completely convinced that I's crush had to be Kawashima. Kimura wept tears of joy, celebrating that Kawashima's feelings were actually mutual, until I-kun spoke up to add another detail. I explained that she was actually the type to aggressively beat up her enemies, causing a completely stunned Kimura's jaw to drop in absolute disbelief. When I added that she was kind but possessed an incredibly foul mouth, a deadpan Kimura instantly realized that the girl was definitely not Kawashima. I confirmed that her personality was completely different from Kawashima's, admitting he had briefly suspected Kawashima at the entrance ceremony before realizing the mismatch. Kimura curiously asked for clarification regarding the part about her violently beating up her enemies, and a sweating eye began to explain. I explained that the girl used to be bullied a lot when they were kids, recalling a day when he had stepped in with a branch to protect her from the troublemakers. However, when I-kun had approached her, he found her twisting ropes around a branch, and she bluntly told him she was setting a trap. She calmly announced she would use the trap to deal with the bullies, which immediately resulted in them being strung up upside down from a tree. While the captured bully yelled that she was playing dirty, the girl looked on with a highly menacing expression while a terrified I-kun watched in horror. The girl retorted that picking on a weak girl was much dirtier, prompting the bully to grumble that she certainly had a smooth tongue. While the bully complained that the rope must have been coated in oil, a highly flustered I-kun weakly apologized for not being able to protect her. The girl smiled gently at him, assuring I-kun that his brave decision to step in and try to protect her was what truly mattered. In the flashback, I stood completely speechless and blushed at her kind words. I explained that she was the first person to truly understand how he felt, and that from that day forward his feelings only grew. He dedicated himself to becoming stronger so that, when they finally met again, he would be capable of protecting her. I laughed awkwardly and admitted that much of his training had ultimately been in vain. Sweat dripped down Kimura's face as he quietly tried to process the shocking realization. Kimura desperately tried to reconcile the massive contradictions, wondering who on earth I's childhood friend could be if it was not Kawashima, despite all the striking similarities. I admitted that, when he first received the anonymous letter, he had honestly hoped it was her trying to get in touch with him. I quietly looked down and added that it seemed his assumption had been completely wrong. As I expressed his lingering hope of meeting his childhood friend again someday, a sweating Kimura stared ahead, finally understanding the true identity of the girl I loved. Kimura questioned if Kawashima's personality had somehow radically changed over the years, though he seriously doubted she would ever resort to setting violent traps even against a bully. Kimura looked at his mental chessboard, realizing that the girl had to be someone else entirely, as an ominous theory began to take root in his mind. Kimura panicked in utter shock, frantically wondering if their romantic comedy world was about to introduce a dreaded third main heroine. Their thoughts were suddenly interrupted when they spotted a confrontation by the playground slide where a boy had grabbed a girl's wrist. The bully aggressively demanded an apology, but the twin-tail girl immediately fired back that he was the one who had bumped into her. The bully growled that she had a lot of nerve, while I and Kimura watched the tension escalate from a short distance away. Seeing that a physical fight was about to break out, I did not hesitate and instantly charged forward to intervene. While I rushed to intervene, the twin-tail girl completely ignored him and bluntly told the bully that he was the one who stank, catching the bully by surprise. Before I could even reach them, the twin-tail girl executed a perfect high-flying kick that slammed directly into the bully's face, sending him crashing to the ground before she coolly walked away. I stood frozen, his eyes wide in utter disbelief, as the girl's defiant words echoed in his mind. As the girl made a snarky comment, her voice and attitude triggered a wave of familiarity. The twin-tail girl's hair caught the light as she began to turn away. I-kun stood completely stunned and whispered her name in dawning realization as Kimura watched in surprise. I-kun questioned if she was really Kawashima as she turned her head back to look at them. The bully remained sprawled on the ground, leaving everyone else in stunned silence across the playground. Kimura compared the violent trap-setting child from I's memories with the gentle Kawashima, he knew, finding too many contradictions to believe they were the same person. Back in the present, Kawashima suddenly stood before them with a heavily blushing, startled face, leaving both Ai and Kimura completely shocked. Kimura stared at her in shock, realizing that her defiant attitude, high kick, and provocative tone perfectly matched every detail of Ai's childhood crush. Chapter 13 began with Kimura's ultimate quest to expose her true identity, depicting Kawashima looking serious as her childhood memories with Ai-kun lingered in the air. Staring at her shadowed face, I noted that she looked exactly like Kawashima and hesitantly started to ask if she was really her. Ai-kun asked in shock if she was really the girl from all those years ago. Kimura stared in silent horror, desperately hoping his suspicions about her double life were wrong. Kimura panicked, realizing in horror that Kawashima's secret past self was effectively acting as the dreaded third main heroine in Ai's romantic comedy world. Kawashima let out a quiet, heavy sigh. Kawashima quietly admitted she really had not wanted to meet him under these circumstances, leaving both Ai and Kimura completely stunned. She picked up her bag and turned to walk away, leaving a stunned Ai to ask what she had just said. Suddenly, Kawashima bolted and sprinted away down the street, leaving a panicked Ai shouting for her to stop, while Kimura stood in complete bewilderment. As Ai-kun watched her run, he stood in complete confusion, thinking to himself that she did not feel like the Kawashima he knew at all. Ai sprinted down the street after Kawashima, leaving a highly determined Kimura to resolve that he had to expose the truth of her double identity once and for all. Kimura pulled up on his bicycle and ordered Ai to hop on the back, and a startled Ai quickly agreed. They pedaled hard but found themselves struggling to close the distance, with Kimura shouting in pure disbelief at how incredibly fast Kawashima was running up ahead. Kimura pedaled furiously while grumbling that even though he was exerting maximum effort, they were not catching up to her at all. Sitting on the back of the bicycle, Ai apologetically thanked Kimura for carrying him and expressed worry that he was getting exhausted. Kimura insisted he was fine and urged him not to worry, stating they needed to settle this for Ai's sake as well, leaving Ai deeply touched by his dedication. Ai blushed furiously as he completely misconstrued Kimura's intense loyalty as a profound romantic confession. Realizing they would lose momentum on the steep hill, Ai suggested they abandon the bicycle to chase her on foot, and the two boys sprinted up the slope after her, gasping for breath. They were completely astounded by her supernatural athletic ability, marveling at how easily she was sprinting up the steep incline. Kimura suddenly announced that he was taking a shortcut through a side street, ordering Ai to continue chasing her straight ahead, which left Ai utterly confused. Kimura's hand slammed against a wall as he confidently analyzed the classic structural rules of a chase sequence. Standing triumphantly at the exit of a narrow alley, Kimura successfully blocked Kawashima's escape route, noting that fleeing characters in a chase inevitably find themselves trapped in a dead end. Kimura declared that they had executed a perfect pincer movement and ordered her to yield, while Ai-kun stood behind her and demanded to know her true identity. Bypassing the dead end entirely, Kawashima leaped up and scaled the tall concrete wall with ease, leaving Ai in awe of her athleticism, while Kimura frantically ordered him to climb over after her. Ai weakly pulled himself to the top of the wall, gasping for breath, as he desperately called out to her that he had finally found her. Ai shouted that he had something important to tell her, but Kawashima continued to run away into the park, tearfully wiping her eyes. Kimura slumped over the wall in complete exhaustion, sweating in panic, as he wondered if Ai was seriously about to execute a romantic confession in a dirty back alley. Ai sprinted ahead after her, prompting Kimura to reflect on how a romantic comedy protagonist always acted immediately once his mind was set. Kimura quietly watched them go with a highly focused expression. They reached a fork in the residential street, where the path split in two opposite directions, causing Kimura to gasp in absolute shock at the dilemma. Ai stood in silent embarrassment, while Kimura watched him sweat in exasperation. Ai suddenly realized something and turned his head, recalling how Kawashima looked both with her hair down and with her pigtails. Kimura let out a silent cry of shock, realizing that Kawashima's pigtails were the ultimate identifying trait of Ai's childhood crush. Determined to catch her, Ai sprinted down the street, declaring it was this way, forcing a panicked Kimura to chase after him while Kawashima walked ahead. Cornering her on the street, Ai passionately confessed that he had always liked her, catching Kawashima completely off guard and leaving her in total shock. As they walked home together under the evening sky, Kawashima stammered in complete confusion, her mind spinning over his sudden confession. I weakly called her name, looking slightly flustered and sweating. Watching from behind, Kimura screamed in utter panic, demanding to know what was happening with their relationship. I asked Kawashima if she had been at the park earlier, and mentioned her passing through narrow alleys, leaving her completely confused. Kawashima repeated his words about oil in complete confusion, while Kimura's sweat dropped as he realized the girl I liked was not Kawashima at all, though he hoped a romance could still blossom from the misunderstanding. Kimura urgently whispered to her to seize the opportunity immediately, while Kawashima looked down seriously and prepared to ask a question. Looking up with a sweet, blushing expression, Kawashima asked I to clarify what exactly he meant by liking her. The wind blew between them as they stood in silence on the street. I clenched his fist in deep embarrassment, sweat dripping from his hand. I suddenly shouted in a panic that he loved udon, and asked if she smelled udon broth nearby, prompting Kimura to scream in absolute rage at such a cliché way to dodge the question. While Kawashima blinked in confusion, Kimura desperately yelled at her not to fall for the dodge, insisting that I had clearly meant his earlier confession, which made her blush softly. Kawashima sweetly agreed that she smelled udon broth too, allowing I to get away with the dodge, and leaving a defeated Kimura face down in complete despair. As they waved goodbye to each other, Kimura lamented that I had actually managed to get away with his excuse, thinking that Kawashima was truly the ultimate losing heroine. Kimura was left in deep thought, still highly curious about who Ai's childhood crush actually was. Returning home, Kawashima announced she was back, only to pause in surprise at the sight of someone else's shoes before being greeted in the hallway. Kawashima called out her little brother's name, Minato, as she walked into the room. Kawashima asked why he was home so early from drama practice, and Minato explained that some creeps had chased him on his way home before warning her not to enter his room. Minato let his skirt drop to the floor, grumbling about his day and contemplating whether he should stop practicing his drama roles at the park. He loosened the wig and picked up his glasses, reflecting on how unlucky it was to bump into his sister's classmate during his practice. Once he put on his glasses, he looked identical to the alternate version of Kawashima from the entrance ceremony, revealing his secret cross-dressing habit. A framed photograph on the desk showed them all together on the day of the entrance ceremony, confirming Minato's presence in their class history. At the school lockers during the uniform changing season, Kimura changed his shoes while trying to make sense of the chaotic events from the previous day. As Kimura stood by his locker, a student approached him from behind and offered a polite morning greeting. Kimura turned around and was surprised to find Kawashima standing there with her hair completely let down. Completely thrown off by her new look, Kimura blankly asked who she was, prompting her to loudly state her own name. Kimura teasingly asked if she had abandoned her signature pigtails, and a flustered Kawashima explained she had simply forgotten her hair accessories during the uniform transition. Kimura yelled in outrage, arguing that a heroine letting her hair down was a massive event that should have been reserved for a school trip or an overnight event. Kimura continued to scold her for wasting such a powerful romantic event, leaving a tearful Kawashima to defend herself as her glasses-wearing brother walked past them down the hallway. Chapter 14 began with Minato's decision to investigate, depicting him in his school uniform holding his sister's glasses and wig. As the school bell rang, Kimura observed Ai and Kawashima interacting in the classroom, noting that, despite all of yesterday's chaos, their distance remained exactly the same. He reflected on all the upcoming summer events, from fireworks and festivals to beach trips and school camping events that could serve as perfect opportunities. Kimura resolved to use the upcoming summer events to finally bring Ai and Kawashima closer together, just as Kawashima approached his desk and called his name. Kawashima asked if she could speak with him for a moment, leaving a confused Kimura to ask if she had not just left the classroom a moment ago. When Kimura suggested they go to a family restaurant to talk, Minato agreed and pulled out his phone to let his parents know he would not be home for dinner. Kimura happened to glance at the phone screen and gasped in utter shock upon seeing a photo of Kawashima set as the wallpaper. Completely misinterpreting the situation, Kimura panicked in disbelief, silently screaming that she actually used a photo of herself as her own phone wallpaper. While Kimura silently concluded that she must have an incredibly high opinion of herself, Minato casually suggested they get moving, and Kimura hesitantly agreed. They arrived at the crowded family restaurant and put their names down on the waiting list before sitting on a bench to wait for a table. Minato's phone played a voice notification saying she had a message, which instantly made a wide-eyed Kimura freeze in absolute shock as he recognized the voice. Kimura's jaw dropped in pure shock as he internally screamed that she had actually set her own voice as her notification sound. While Kimura continued to reel in disbelief at her apparent narcissism, Minato happily noted that he had received a reply on his phone. Kimura tried to convince himself that he was simply hearing things because such a narcissistic person could not possibly exist, while Minato mentioned needing to send some files to his friends. Minato opened his photo gallery to select the files, revealing a screen completely packed with selfies that left Kimura completely flabbergasted by the sheer quantity. Kimura was astounded by her apparent obsession with selfies, but forced himself to look away, noting how happily she smiled at the screen just as the waiter called their name. The waiter led them to their table after reading her self-written reservation name, super duper cutest, Manaka Kawashima-sama, leaving a sweat-dropping Kimura to conclude that she was completely out of her mind. Sitting across from her, a deeply guilty Kimura worried that his harsh words about her losing her potential earlier that morning had shattered her confidence and driven her to this desperate coping mechanism. Kimura covered his face and sincerely apologized to her, leaving a completely baffled Minato to ask what he meant before Kimura turned the conversation to what he had wanted to ask. Minato smiled and asked him how long it had been since they first met, prompting a confused Kimura to let out a startled gasp. Kimura replied that it had been about half a year since the start of the school term, privately wondering if she was suffering from amnesia, as she quietly nodded. Minato gritted his teeth upon hearing it had only been half a year, but when Kimura asked if she had said something, he quickly put on a bright, innocent smile and denied it. Minato realized that he had narrowly avoided exposing his true identity as Kawashima's twin brother. Observing Kimura, Minato recalled how this guy had harshly scolded his sister that morning and chased after him during his park practice yesterday. Minato narrowed his eyes with intense protective gravity, firmly deciding to evaluate whether Kimura was a man who deserved to be anywhere near his sister. Minato quietly resolved to be the one to judge Kimura's character. Kimura casually asked if this consultation was about the usual stuff again, which caused Minato to panic internally upon realizing his sister had been constantly consulting with Kimura. Minato frantically wondered if his sister consulted Kimura about friendships or studying before immediately ruling out studying, since he was the one who always tutored her. Meanwhile, Kimura looked at his phone to place their food order. Deciding to go with a safe bet, Minato vaguely claimed that he had gotten into a fight with a friend. Kimura bluntly replied that such matters were outside his area of expertise and told him to solve it with the relevant people. Irritated by the dismissal, Minato internally wondered if Kimura was actually just a piece of trash. Still wondering what his sister usually asked about, Minato pressed further, insisting he really wanted Kimura to listen and asking what his bad points were in Kimura's eyes. Kimura stated he could not answer that without hearing the story first. Kimura started by pointing out the missing twin tails, then frankly added that she was a complete klutz. Minato found Kimura's obsession with the twin tails deeply disturbing and silently bristled at being called a klutz. Kimura casually added that the clumsiness was also part of her charm, prompting a pleased Minato to boldly agree that Kimura finally understood. Kimura looked at him in confusion and suspiciously repeated the phrase, making Minato immediately realize his slip-up. Kimura noted that Kawashima would usually deny it, completely leaving Minato to awkwardly laugh it off while internally cursing his mistake. Kimura pointed out that the way she signed them in was weird too and directly asked if she was really Kawashima. Minato panicked at the confrontation, realizing that Kimura was actually quite sharp. Seeing no other way out, Minato resolved to purposely spill his food to accurately mimic his clumsy sister just as the food delivery robot arrived at their table. As Minato cheerfully picked up a hot plate, a running child suddenly slammed directly into the delivery cart from behind. Kimura shouted a warning and immediately reached out across the table, catching the falling hot plate with his bare hand. Kimura cried out in pain from the burning heat, but quickly asked if she was hurt, to which a completely stunned Minato quietly replied that he was not. Kimura grimaced and carefully held his burnt hand. Minato stared at Kimura in silent, wide-eyed surprise. Kimura casually remarked that having such bad luck was exactly like Kawashima, and Minato quickly agreed, while realizing that Kimura was truly the type of person who would throw himself in harm's way to protect someone. Minato looked down thoughtfully. As they ate their meal in silence, Minato quietly decided to just keep a close eye on Kimura for the time being. When Kawashima noticed Ai carrying a bunch of cleaning supplies and asked about it, Ai explained that he had been asked to clean the pool for a bit. As Kawashima eagerly offered to help him, Kimura silently celebrated that pool cleaning was a classic romantic comedy duty that would surely deliver some peak scenes, until someone suddenly interrupted them. Takabe suddenly appeared with a stern expression and demanded to know who would cook today's meal if I was busy cleaning. A sweating Ai weakly pointed out that there was no point in bringing that up now, prompting Takabe to let out an exasperated sigh. Kawashima brightly suggested that getting more people to help would allow them to finish the cleaning much faster. Takabe immediately turned to Kimura and declared that he was coming too, leaving him completely startled before he awkwardly admitted to Ai that he did not actually enjoy doing such chores. Chapter 15 began with the pool cleaning event depicting Kawashima kneeling on the wet deck in her gym uniform as she firmly gripped her mop. The four of them gathered by the pool with their cleaning tools, and Takabe loudly declared the start of their work session. Ai apologetically told Kimura he was sorry for dragging him into the chore, but Kimura assured him not to worry about it as they listened to Takabe complain about the slippery floor nearby. Kimura turned his attention to Kawashima and bluntly asked why she was wearing her physical education uniform. Kawashima cheerfully explained that she wanted to prioritize functionality, prompting a frustrated Kimura to internally scream that a soaked school uniform was a peak romantic comedy event, and she had completely ruined the opportunity. Kimura stared at her intensely and urgently warned her that the romantic battle had already begun right at that very moment. Kawashima nervously laughed and admitted she was losing her balance because the floor was so slippery, leaving Kimura to exasperatedly note her terrible core strength as she trembled violently in place. As Kawashima violently wobbled and began to fall panicked, Kimura frantically instructed her to make sure she slipped towards Ai instead. Completely losing her balance, Kawashima collapsed directly onto Kimura, instead landing with her heavily blushing face just inches away from his. Kawashima frantically jumped back and loudly apologized in pure embarrassment, while a deadpan Kimura knelt on the wet ground and reminded her that she was supposed to pull those kinds of romantic stunts with Ai. Kawashima quietly looked down in embarrassment, just as Ai urgently called out to ask if she was all right. Trying to recover from her embarrassment, Kawashima grabbed the hose and announced she would just run some water to avoid slipping, prompting a panicked Kimura to yell for her to stop, as she carelessly swung the spraying hose around. Kawashima accidentally stepped on the hose, squeezing it tight under her bare foot. The built-up pressure suddenly released, blasting a powerful stream of water directly into Takabe's face and leaving everyone else in shock. Takabe angrily yelled that she was entirely soaked, prompting a frantic apology from Kawashima, while Kimura panicked as he realized exactly where the situation was heading. Ai blushed furiously and stammered out a startled warning to Takabe. Takabe wiped the water from her face and realized that her soaked white school shirt had become completely see-through. As a flustered Takabe desperately tried to cover herself up, Kimura internally groaned that it was turning into a classic trope where Ai would heroically offer his own shirt to cover her. However, Takabe completely bypassed the trope by nonchalantly taking off her soaked uniform, explaining that she was already wearing a swimsuit underneath, which left Ai blushing and looking away while Kimura stared in utter shock. Kimura recoiled as if blinded, marveling at the winning heroine's brilliance for having a second form and maximizing her functionality by wearing a swimsuit underneath, before he suddenly remembered to check on Kawashima. Kimura called out her name in alarm as he found Kawashima staring blankly ahead with completely hollow, defeated eyes. As the school loudspeaker buzzed to life, Kimura frustratedly noted that Takabe was completely owning the game now and desperately wondered if there was anything he could do to salvage the situation. The loudspeaker announced that there was a message for Kawashima and requested her presence at the faculty office, leaving her to flinch in surprise and wonder what it could be about. Kawashima immediately announced she would be right back and dashed away from the pool, leaving Kimura completely dumbfounded. Kimura reached out in sheer panic, internally screaming that she had just established a perfect romantic event flag, only to immediately abandon it. I stood quietly by himself on the wet pool deck. Kawashima returned moments later and apologized for the wait, prompting a surprised Ai to note how fast she was, while she casually explained to Takabe that the summons was merely regarding a test. Without warning, Takabe squeezed the hose nozzle and blasted a high-pressure stream of water directly into Ai's face, loudly declaring it was her payback. A coughing Ai demanded to know what that was for, and an angry Takabe yelled that she had actually been aiming for Kawashima, but he had gotten in the way. While Takabe laughed at Ai's expression, and he continued to complain, Kimura quietly called out to Kawashima as she undid her wet pigtails. Kimura bluntly told her that she could have closed more distance with Ai just now, while Takabe and Ai continued to playfully bicker in the background. Kimura clenched his teeth in intense frustration, scolding her for completely wasting such a high-potential romantic event. Kawashima stood silently with her hair let down, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her hair ties, leaving Kimura completely stunned by her sudden emotional reaction. Snapping out of his shock, Kimura firmly grabbed her wrist and demanded she come with him, catching her completely off guard. He led her away from the pool deck and straight into the school building, walking quietly up the stairs together. Once inside the hallway, Kawashima nervously asked him what was wrong, but Kimura kept his face shadowed and intensely confronted her. Kimura directly stated his suspicion, asking if she was actually not the real Kawashima at all, leaving her standing in tense silence. Kawashima tried to laugh it off with a bright smile and asked what he even meant, but Kimura immediately shouted his accusation that he was actually a guy, while internally panicking that the situation was turning incredibly bad. Dropping the innocent act, Minato smirked mockingly and casually noted that they had an unidentified pervert on their hands. Kimura frantically wondered who around Kawashima would do something like this, before suddenly recalling Kawashima mentioning her little brother tutoring her for 15 hours a day, making him realize just how extreme he could be. Piecing the clues together, Kimura hesitantly asked if he was her little brother. Putting on his glasses with a confident smile, Minato confirmed the guess and formally introduced himself as Minato Kawashima. Kimura nervously noted the twin revelation and internally cursed as the situation escalated, realizing that Minato radiated an incredibly severe sister complex aura. Kimura asked if Minato was the one behind the strange behavior at the park and the family restaurant encounter, which Minato cheerfully confirmed while praising Kimura for catching on so quickly. Kimura's eyes widened in sheer horror as all the past interactions flooded his mind, finally realizing that the violent, foul-mouthed childhood friend I actually liked was Minato all along. Completely disturbed by the sudden revelation, Kimura bluntly asked Minato why he was dressed like his sister in the first place. Minato smugly explained that he wore the outfit to do some investigating around his sister for the sake of protecting her, leaving Kimura to sweat drop and silently label him as a complete extremist. Minato revealed that his true goal was to check up on Ai, but after observing the pool cleaning event, he deduced that Kimura was actively trying to hook his sister up with him. Minato firmly demanded that Kimura stop trying to set them up, explaining that he had already done some asking around. Minato pointed out that Ai was currently living with his fiancée and that they were close enough to say anything to each other, aggressively questioning if there was genuinely any opening for his sister to win his heart. Staring with a dark, intense expression, Minato firmly declared that he simply did not want to see his sister end up looking sad. Kimura listened quietly with a shadowed face, acknowledging Minato's protective mindset, before calmly stating that their perspectives were fundamentally not the same. Minato firmly stated that he simply wanted to see his sister looking happy, while Kimura listened quietly. Kimura calmly replied that as long as the romantic match was not over, he would continue pushing her forward. Kimura added with fierce determination that he truly believed in her potential. Minato thoughtfully acknowledged Kimura's words, conceding that there was some truth to what he was saying. Smiling competitively, Minato challenged Kimura to a match, declaring that he would interfere with everything he had as long as Kimura continued acting as his sister's wingman. Minato confidently pinned Kimura against the wall and declared it a battle of wits, officially initiating a war between his desire to stop the romance and Kimura's desire to make Kawashima win. Kimura stared at him in confusion and nervously repeated the phrase, questioning what a battle of wits even meant in this context. Chapter 16 began with Manato's determination to interfere, depicting him smirking confidently as he adjusted his glasses. Kawashima suddenly walked up the stairs and caught Manato pinning Kimura against the wall, asking in complete confusion what they were doing. Kimura panicked as he realized the very girl they were arguing about had just arrived, while Kawashima stared in silence before asking if the two of them knew each other. Manato casually lied that he had just met him, prompting a desperate Kimura to immediately try exposing Manato's secret by loudly announcing that he was dressing up as her. Before Kimura could finish his sentence, Manato forcefully stomped down on his foot, causing Kimura to cry out in sharp pain while Kawashima watched in complete confusion. Kimura realized that Manato desperately wanted to keep his cross-dressing secret hidden from his sister, while Manato quietly threatened to kill him if he told her, leaving Kimura terrified of his intense glare. Completely oblivious to the tension, Kawashima happily clapped her hands together and asked if Manato was going to help them with the pool cleaning. Manato bluntly replied that he was absolutely not going to help, leaving Kimura to cry out in baffled shock at his straightforward refusal. As Manato calmly walked past them, Kimura sweat dropped and recalled how fiercely protective he had been just moments ago, utterly astounded by how completely two-faced the brother was. With Manato gone, Kawashima turned her attention back to Kimura and curiously asked what the two of them had been talking about in the stairwell. Kimura bluntly answered that they were talking about Ai, causing Kawashima to gasp with wide, sparkling eyes in eager anticipation. Kawashima panicked and loudly asked Manato how he knew about Ai, while a sweating Kimura nervously noted to himself that Manato had been investigating Ai this entire time. Manato bluntly asked why she liked a guy like him. Kawashima looked up in complete confusion at her brother's sudden question. Manato pointed out that even though Ai had a fiancé, he still goofed around with everyone, and was obviously way too close to his fiancé, though Kawashima nervously disagreed about him goofing around. Rephrasing his question, Manato asked what was genuinely so good about a guy like Ai, prompting Kawashima to enthusiastically begin explaining how nice he was back then. Manato completely cut her off, arguing that anyone could act nice if they just put on a good face, pointing out that literally any random guy nearby could pull it off. Manato used Kimura as an example, stating that even he could act nice, which caused Kawashima to blush furiously and stammer her agreement. Manato immediately scolded her for not providing an actual counter-argument before continuing his point. Manato boldly claimed that Ai liked MILF, leaving Kimura to internally scream that the accusation was complete nonsense. Manato continued by claiming Ai was the type of guy to dilute his empty shampoo bottles with water, prompting Kimura to mentally yell that Manato was just projecting his own baseless prejudices. Manato concluded that Ai simply relied on his nice guy image to get by, and asked if he just seemed like a sugar-coated scumbag, leaving an exasperated Kimura to wonder why he was making such wild claims. An upset Kawashima firmly demanded to know why Manato was saying all those terrible things about him. Manato paused and hesitated to answer her question. Manato sincerely explained that he would hate to have someone like Ai in their family when thinking about the future, which left Kimura blushing in absolute shock that the brother was already thinking that far ahead about marriage. Kawashima quietly disagreed and asked if he was actually saying all of this just for her sake, catching Manato completely off guard. Kawashima took a step forward and confidently stated that she could tell his true intentions because she was always watching him. She calmly revealed that she already knew his secret, prompting a confused Manato to ask what she meant. Kawashima bluntly declared that she already knew he had been cross-dressing as her. Manato froze in utter disbelief, while Kimura let out a loud shout of pure shock. While an astounded Kimura wondered how the brother would react to his sister, silently knowing his secret all along, Kawashima gently explained that she knew he always pretended to be her in order to protect her, whenever she could not handle things herself. Completely overwhelmed by the sudden exposure of his secret, Manato began to violently shake and let out a broken stammer, leaving a panicked Kimura to notice that his eyes had completely lost focus. Kawashima looked at him gently and asked if that wasn't right. Stepping closer to her brother, Kawashima firmly demanded that he answer her. Manato stood completely speechless, unable to form a response to his sister's confrontation. Overwhelmed by the confrontation, Minato lost his footing and began to fall backward down the stairs, prompting a panicked Kimura to yell a warning. Kawashima quickly lunged forward and grabbed Minato's shirt to break his fall, firmly declaring that she had more to say. Looking directly at him, she forcefully shouted that she was no longer the same person she had been in the past. As Minato listened in stunned silence, Kawashima continued her earnest plea. Pulling him back up to safety on the steps, she sincerely asked him to stop bad-mouthing other people. Kimura internally cheered for Kawashima's brave stand, while Minato quietly asked if she really meant what she said. Minato suddenly swatted Kawashima's hand away, casually stating that he was merely offering his advice. Without another word, Minato turned his back on them and walked away up the stairs, leaving his sister and Kimura behind in silence. Kawashima turned to Kimura with an awkward laugh and apologized for dragging him into their family drama, which Kimura hesitantly brushed off. Kimura gently offered that Minato was probably just acting that way because he deeply cared about her. Kawashima smiled and softly agreed with him, bowing her head slightly in appreciation. Blushing slightly with a warm smile, she happily declared that Minato was a little brother she was genuinely proud of. She recalled several past moments where Minato had firmly stood by her side while she cried and struggled to handle things on her own. Walking alone down the empty sunlit hallway, Minato let out a quiet huff to himself. Later in the home economics room, the teacher instructed the class to pair up with their seatmates to make sweets, prompting an excited Kimura to internally celebrate his perfect luck. Kimura enthusiastically anticipated the cooking event, expecting Kawashima to clumsily cut her finger or burn herself so they could trigger the classic trope where Ai teaches the clumsy heroine how to cook. Kimura rolled out dough next to Kawashima, confidently telling himself that since it was her, a peak romantic comedy moment was inevitably bound to happen. Instead, Kawashima and Ai efficiently finished making their muffins in no time while happily complimenting each other's skills, leaving a deadpan Kimura completely disappointed that the task ended without a single peak moment for the camera. Chapter 17 began with Kawashima and Takabe presenting their baked goods, with Takabe looking confident while Kawashima appeared slightly nervous, holding a plate of burnt pieces. Surprised that Kawashima actually knew how to cook, Kimura turned to his other side and asked Takabe how things were going on her end, to which she calmly replied that her cookies were currently baking in the oven. Kimura internally noted that the worst cooks always provided the best content in these situations, but before he could finish assuming that simply making cookies would be perfectly safe, a massive explosion violently erupted from Takabe's oven. Ai flinched and covered his ears in shock from the deafening blast. A frantic Ai demanded to know what Takabe was doing, and she defensively yelled back that the oven had just blown up on its own, leaving an absolutely astounded Kimura to scream, internally wondering if this explosive chaos was the true power of a winning heroine. A deadpan Kimura reflected on how he had followed the ingredient measurements strictly specifically to avoid any trouble, only for Takabe's side to end up in complete disaster anyway. Takabe held up her baking tray, revealing that her cookies had been completely reduced to blackened lumps of charcoal. Takabe stubbornly blamed the oven and called it a piece of junk, prompting Ai to yell that she had simply overheated it like an idiot, which immediately sparked an argument between them, until Kimura stepped in to break up the bickering. Kimura suggested they quickly make one more batch, but before they could start, the school chime rang out and the teacher announced that their time was up. The teacher added that the assignment counted toward their grades and instructed everyone to hand in whatever they had made, causing both Kimura and Takabe to completely freeze in utter horror. The two of them stared down at their tray of pure charcoal in complete dread-filled silence. As Takabe looked away in deep guilt, Kimura nervously scratched his head and tried to reassure her that the failed cookies probably would not have a massive impact on their overall grades. Walking down the hallway alone after class as the school bell rang, Kimura thoughtfully recalled Takabe's visibly guilty reaction to ruining their assignment. He noted that she genuinely looked like she felt responsible for the disaster, and nervously peeked into the home economics room, wondering if she was actually staying after school to practice cooking in a completely cliché romantic comedy development. Kimura gasped in pure shock as he saw Takabe aggressively pouring ingredients into a bowl and coughing through a thick cloud of smoke, realizing she was actually committing to the classic trope. Suddenly, Kimura spotted a dazed Ai walking down the hallway toward the room, instantly panicking as he realized the male lead was arriving to trigger the romantic event from another angle. Kimura's imagination immediately ran wild as he pictured Ai gently teaching Takabe how to mix the batter while her shirt ended up covered in messy spills, leaving an absolutely thrilled Kimura to aggressively celebrate that the classic cooking event was finally falling into place. Kimura firmly declared that he was stopping the cliché right here and now loudly bursting into the room and startling Takabe. When Takabe asked what he was doing, Kimura awkwardly claimed that he had just tripped and fallen into the room by accident. Moving past his clumsy entrance, Kimura asked if she was trying to remake the cookies from the assignment, noticing the star-shaped cutter in her hand. A blushing Takabe quietly admitted she was trying again because she had completely messed up with the oven earlier, while Kimura sighed and assured her he was not actually bothered by their failure. Takabe guiltily noted that he had followed the measurements so strictly while she had still managed to ruin it, but Kimura internally admitted he only restricted her to prevent any peak romantic scenes from triggering. Kimura pointed out that even if she successfully finished remaking the cookies, the teacher had already gone home for the day, leaving Takabe completely shocked. Accepting the reality of the situation, Takabe quietly placed the cookie cutters down on the counter. Looking visibly dejected, Takabe murmured that all her extra effort was for nothing, prompting Kimura to watch her quietly. Kimura suddenly told her that anyone could successfully bake as long as they actually followed the recipe and measurements, completely confusing Takabe. Rolling up his sleeves, Kimura declared that it was much better to wrap things up with a success rather than ending the day on a complete failure. Kimura mentally reasoned that letting her go home in such a gloomy mood would be a massive pain, specifically because it might lead to Ai stepping in to teach her how to cook later instead. Kimura firmly instructed her to start by actually following the exact measurements, this time making Takabe jump in surprise, before quickly agreeing. Looking at the bowl of prepped ingredients, Takabe enthusiastically held up an electric hand mixer and asked if she should use it to mix everything together. Takabe wildly turned the mixer on, proudly claiming to be a mixing expert, while Kimura tried to warn her not to wave the running machine around. A panicked Kimura yelled at her to stop brandishing it while the power was still on, but her long hair suddenly began getting sucked into the spinning blades. Takabe let out a loud scream as the mixer aggressively tangled itself into her hair, leaving an exasperated Kimura to yell that he had just warned her about it. Takabe desperately tugged at the tangled machine, complaining that it stubbornly refused to come out, while Kimura stared in sheer disbelief at how she had managed to cause such a bizarre disaster. Hearing the mixer severely tangled in her hair, Kimura grimly stated that if the situation had really come to this, there was only one option left. Kimura suddenly pulled out a large kitchen knife and firmly ordered her to hold still, making Takabe freeze in sheer terror. Misunderstanding his intention completely, Takabe grabbed the knife herself and prepared to blindly chop off her own hair to free the mixer, forcing a horrified Kimura to frantically yell that only a total psycho would resort to cutting it like that. Takabe stubbornly insisted that he just cut her hair off, but Kimura firmly asked if he could touch her to untangle it, explaining that he could not stand it if she caused any more trouble, which prompted her to quietly relent. As he carefully worked the mixer out, Kimura noted that she had beautiful hair and sincerely asked her to take better care of it. Takabe blushed fiercely and stammered in complete shock at being called beautiful. Kimura successfully freed the mixer and casually announced that it was finally untangled, leaving Takabe trembling in flustered silence. Moving on, Kimura calmly explained the next steps, noting that they just needed to mix the dough, roll it out, and heat it up in the oven. They successfully finished baking a perfect tray of cute assorted cookies, leaving Takabe staring in awe. Kimura noted that they turned out great, and a thrilled Takabe happily agreed, but when Kimura asked if she was taking them home with her, she immediately confirmed that she was. Kimura panicked as he imagined Takabe handing the homemade cookies to Ai in a classic tsundere confession, quickly calling out her name to stop the impending romantic event. With an intense expression, Kimura boldly declared that he was going to take all of the cookies for himself, leaving a completely stunned Takabe to cry out in disbelief. Kimura immediately shoved a whole cookie into his mouth and casually claimed he was hungry, while a frustrated Takabe demanded to know why he was doing that. Kimura grabbed the bag of remaining cookies and announced he was leaving, walking out of the room while Takabe angrily yelled after him in confusion. Left alone in the room, Takabe quietly looked down at the leftover cookie crumbs scattered on the counter. Realizing they had never actually tested them, she popped a crumb into her mouth only to instantly flinch in disgust. She coughed violently, crying out that the cookies were incredibly salty because she had accidentally mixed up the salt and sugar earlier. Blushing furiously in realization, she covered her mouth and wondered why Kimura had willingly eaten such a terrible cookie without a single complaint. Meanwhile, Kimura walked quietly down the empty school hallway. He violently coughed and struggled to force the terribly salty cookie down his throat with a hard gulp. Sweating heavily, Kimura let out a strained breath and quietly muttered to himself about how incredibly salty it was. Kimura concluded that the person I liked was actually Kawashima's little brother dressed up as her. Kimura wondered if this presented a chance, but quickly questioned if it would actually work out. Chapter 18 began with Kawashima's desire to reveal a secret depicting her smiling while her brother rested behind her. Walking down the hallway, Kimura considered keeping the fact that it was her brother a secret. Kimura theorized that they could somehow connect the present Kawashima with her past self. Kimura noted that in romantic comedies, there were broadly two types of moments where the main character fell for the heroine. He explained that it involved either seeing their strength or seeing their weakness. Kimura recalled that the moment I fell in love was when he witnessed her strength as she beat up her enemies, but he quickly noted a catch. Kimura realized that since the current Kawashima was purely soft and fluffy, it was incredibly hard to imagine her demonstrating that kind of strength. Kimura concluded that if they could somehow link that kind of strength to Kawashima, it would seal the deal. Kimura bluntly told Kawashima that the person I liked was actually her little brother, cross-dressing as her, causing her to jolt in absolute shock. Kimura sighed in relief, stating that the only difference was their chromosomes, and that her brother was exactly like her, but an exasperated Kawashima argued that the most important part was completely different. A nervous Kawashima asked if she should just tell I the truth, prompting an angry Kimura to yell that she was seriously trying to throw away her own chance at victory and ruining the setup for peak scenes. Kimura explained that while her brother was the trigger for Ai's love, it was only possible because of all the memories Ai already had with her up until that point, which made her question if that was really true. Kimura asked if she had simply overlooked her brother's bizarre behavior this whole time and questioned what kind of relationship she actually had with Minato. Kawashima recalled that Minato could do anything better than anyone else since they were young, while she could not do anything at all. She listed examples of her childhood failures, noting her struggles with studying, doing a back hip circle, and participating in school recitals. Kawashima explained that she was always holding everyone back, getting bullied by other kids and constantly crying at home. She mentioned that after they moved and she was separated from Ai, there was a period where she would only go to the school infirmary. A teacher suddenly approached her to praise her for doing such a good job in class that day, completely surprising Kawashima as she realized Minato had secretly taken her place. Kawashima recalled that during a recital she realized Minato had been pretending to be her. She secretly watched from behind the door as Minato confidently took her place at the front of the classroom. She explained that after they moved, Minato had been secretly helping her so that she would not be laughed at in their new environment. She admitted it was her fault for not being able to handle things herself, recalling a time she tried to confront Minato, but could not bring herself to say anything, and simply told him to never mind. Kneeling on the ground, Kawashima quietly added that she never expected the situation to turn out like this. Kawashima gloomily lamented that Minato was actually the one I remembered, but Kimura quickly reassured her that I was probably just drawn to how intense Minato's quirks were. Kimura pointed out that I fell for a person who possessed the strength to strike back while also showing a gentle side. Kimura summarized that I had essentially fallen for a chimera Kawashima, picturing a bizarre fusion of her and her brother, while an exasperated Kawashima ignored the analogy and asked what Kimura and I were like back then. Kawashima suddenly looked up in quiet realization. She recalled a voice asking her if she could even see in front of her. Kawashima gasped in shock as she remembered a young eye staring at her upside down. She remembered sitting alone inside a dome structure at a playground. Looking down at the ground, Kawashima quietly trailed off. Kawashima awkwardly laughed and admitted she had been so nervous back then that she could not even speak properly, prompting Kimura to state his amazement that she had somehow managed to lock in a marriage promise under those conditions. While a heavily blushing Kawashima stammered, Kimura dismissed the thought and decided to get back to the main point. Kimura pointed out that I did not know she had a younger brother and did not believe she was the girl from his past. He explained that from I's perspective, she had changed too much, so he was not perceiving a simple gap in personality, but rather thinking of her as a completely different person. Kimura compared the situation to the classic trope, where a childhood friend turns out to be a girl, noting that in those scenarios, a gap appeal works, because their inside personality remains the same despite their outside appearance changing. He clarified that right now Kawashima and the person I remembered looked exactly the same on the outside, but their inside personalities were completely different. Kimura warned that if she confessed and claimed to be the girl from back then under these conditions, I would just be hit with confusion before he could even feel any romance. Kimura added that it would be a completely different story if a certain condition was met, firmly stating that the key was for her to finally show her strong side to I. Kimura explained that she needed to connect her past and present versions in I's mind by demonstrating her strength. Kimura stated that once I realized she was indeed the girl from his past, it would provide the perfect timing for her to confess. Kimura reminded her that Minato was the one I actually fell in love with, completely deflating her, before angrily demanding to know if she was seriously going to lose to her cross-dressing brother. Kimura clarified that I was not looking for physical strength, explaining that she needed to show him her mental strength instead. Looking out the window at her, Kimura pointed out that she already possessed that kind of mental strength. While Kawashima fiercely dug in the dirt, she nervously asked if there would even be a situation to show her strength, prompting Kimura to remind her about the event coming up next week. Kimura held up a flyer and announced the upcoming school camping trip. Kimura explained that the trip was a chance to show a side of herself she could not normally show at school, noting that troubles always accompanied such events. Kimura instructed that when trouble inevitably happened, and I showed a moment of weakness, she needed to cover for him and display her strength to set up the finishing blow. Kimura declared that the campfire would serve as the finishing blow, bringing up the classic rumor that two people who dance together there will end up as a couple. Kimura warned her that inviting him right now would be a bad move, since it was synonymous with a confession, advising her to make the move only after demonstrating her strength. Kimura dramatically declared that by executing this plan, her past and present would connect, allowing her to step into a new future with him. Kimura envisioned her dramatically revealing her identity as his childhood friend, securing a complete checkmate at the campfire. Kimura fiercely yelled for Kawashima to show everyone the true potential of a losing heroine. Fired up by his passionate speech, Kawashima loudly confirmed that she understood the plan. The students boarded the bus for the school camping trip, signaling the start of their crucial opportunity to make progress on the relationship. As the students gathered outside the bus, a serious Kimura noted that it was finally time to begin. Carrying her backpack, Kawashima stepped forward with a highly determined expression, knowing that the success of the camping trip was entirely up to her. A complex relationship chart displayed the current state of the characters' connections, highlighting the various active love triangles and rivalries among the group. Kawashima confidently reached her hand forward. Smiling brightly, Kawashima offered to take the lead and told I to leave things to her. A surprised I cheerfully agreed, while a sweat-dropping Kimura silently noted that she was acting differently. Kawashima immediately tripped over a rock while warning them to watch their step, prompting I to tell her to be careful, while Kimura internally groaned that she completely misunderstood what it meant to be strong. Chapter 19 began with Kawashima showing off her determination, depicting her enthusiastically posing in the forest for the school camping trip. Kawashima excitedly ran through their schedule for the day, listing the stamp, rally, lunch, campfire prep, and finally, the campfire itself. Looking at her, Kimura noted that they still had plenty of time before the main event. Suddenly, Kawashima shouted for I to watch out and dove forward. She aggressively swatted away a bee that was flying towards him, completely startling I, while Kimura and Takabe watched in silence. Shortly after, I accidentally walked face first into a large spider web. Then a foot snagged on the uneven ground and violently tripped. I's clumsy fall caused him to accidentally pull Takabe's pants down, revealing her underwear and leaving her blushing fiercely, while Kimura watched in stunned silence. Kimura angrily thought to himself that I had turned into a walking disaster, deciding he had seen enough of his clumsiness. As I stood up with his face covered in leaves and dirt, Takabe noted his mess and offered him some towels. Takabe smugly presented a stack of neatly folded towels for him to choose from, prompting Kimura to deadpan that her gesture was not actually as cool as she thought it was. I politely declined explaining he had brought an extra shirt, leaving a sweat-dropping Kimura to wonder why he was so over-prepared. As I began taking off his dirty shirt, he admitted that he had always been like this. I explained that he just had incredibly bad luck, recalling how he was always tripping or accidentally ruining things, while the others listened. Takabe let out an annoyed sigh, stating she was tired of hearing about his supposed condition, and arguing that he was only bringing the bad luck upon himself by constantly thinking about it. Arriving at the first stamp rally checkpoint, the staff handed them their stamp, while I continued to complain. Kimura wondered if his constant complaining was the real reason he tripped so much. Noticing I looking completely gloomy, Kimura decided it was the perfect time for Kawashima to show her strength, and loudly interrupted. Kimura urged Kawashima to step up and become Ai's pillar of emotional support, telling her to show him exactly how strong she was. Stepping forward with a bright smile, Kawashima tried to cheer him up by cheerfully admitting that she tripped a lot too, leaving an exasperated Kimura to scream internally about her completely missing the point. As Kawashima casually pointed something out ahead, a defeated Kimura realized they still had a very long road ahead of them before she could successfully pull off the plan. Someone noted that their next destination was just up ahead, revealing a long suspension bridge stretching across a deep gorge. Takabe complained that she was already tired of the hike and questioned if there was still more to go, while I pointed out that they would never finish if they did not keep moving. Completely exhausted, I handed the stamp card to Kimura and decided to rest there, telling him to go ahead and get the stamp instead. Kimura realized this was actually a perfect opportunity, calculating that if I and Kawashima got some alone time near the suspension bridge, it would definitely trigger some peak romantic scenes. Feigning reluctance, Kimura sighed that it could not be helped and forcefully stepped onto the wooden planks of the suspension bridge. With a loud crack, the old wooden planks suddenly broke right beneath their feet. Startled by the sudden collapse, Kawashima let out a surprised gasp and immediately jumped backward to safety. As the bridge gave way, Kimura firmly grabbed a panicked Ai by the shoulder and shoved him back to solid ground. Kimura plummeted straight down into the gorge alone, while Kawashima watched in horror. Kimura hit the river below with a massive splash, causing Kawashima and Takabe to scream in pure shock. Surfacing from the water, Kimura coughed violently while Kawashima, Takabe, and I frantically peered over the broken edge and yelled for him to hold on. A terrified Kawashima called down to ask if he was okay, to which a soaking wet Kimura casually replied that he was completely fine since the drop was not actually that high. Wiping the water from his face, Kimura pointed down the riverbed and told them he could just meet up with them later, by taking that route, leaving the group dazed by his sheer nonchalance. I stood silently at the edge of the cliff, watching Kimura calmly wade away through the shallow water below. Left behind on the forest path, Kawashima and Takabe stood awkwardly together in utter bewildered silence. Takabe noted that Kimura was not showing up, prompting a panicked Ai to ask if he had gotten lost. Kawashima volunteered to go look for him, but Takabe immediately shot the idea down, arguing she would just make things worse, and asking about his phone, to which I frantically replied that he could not reach him. Kawashima quietly recalled how Kimura had reliably stepped in to protect her in the past. Filled with sudden determination, Kawashima started to speak up. The wind quietly rustled through the dense, silent canopy of the forest. Elsewhere, Kimura stared at his dripping phone and sighed that it was completely waterlogged. Kimura finally stepped back onto the main path, casually noting that he had managed to make it back somehow. He apologized to Takabe and I for being late and explained that the path was rough, leaving them both staring at him in complete shock. Confused by their stunned expressions, Kimura casually asked where Kawashima was. A trembling Ai stammered out that just a moment ago. Ai's words lingered as Kawashima raced deeper into the dense woods. I explained that she went looking for him while Kawashima frantically sprinted down the forest path. Kimura let out a startled gasp of disbelief while Kawashima reached the broken suspension bridge with absolute determination to find him. In a childhood memory at the park, a voice asked Kawashima if she could even see with her hair hanging down like that. A young Kawashima gasped in surprise as eyes suddenly hung upside down from the dome structure right in front of her. The young Ai cheerfully gathered her messy hair and tied it back, explaining that he did this for his little sister all the time. He finished tying her hair into neat pigtails and smiled, leaving Kawashima staring at him with wide, awestruck eyes. Chapter 20 began with Kawashima firmly pressing forward through the forest, thinking to herself that I was the one who had brought light into her life. The trees stretched high into the sky above the quiet forest path. I panicked and blamed himself, offering to go look for Kimura, but Kawashima immediately interrupted and firmly declared that she would go look for him instead. Without hesitation, Kawashima sprinted away into the dense woods, ignoring Ai's desperate shouts for her to hold on, while Takabe watched in shock. As she ran down the rough path, Kawashima thought back on all the times Kimura had stepped in to actively protect and guide her. She realized that Kimura was always acting for someone else's sake and deeply appreciated how incredibly kind he had been to her all this time. She admitted to herself that she had simply accepted his kindness without ever thinking too deeply about the reasons behind it. The wind whipped through the trees as she tried to convince herself that he was perfectly fine. Suddenly, Kawashima lost her footing on the uneven terrain and let out a terrified cry as she violently slipped and slid down the steep dirt slope. Just before she could plummet any further, a hand shot out and firmly grabbed her arm. Kimura successfully caught her mid-fall, holding her securely over the edge of the steep drop. Kimura let out a breath of relief and noted that he had made it just in time, while a completely shocked Kawashima cried out his name. As Kimura pulled her back up onto the safe path, a frantic Kawashima asked if he was hurt, prompting Kimura to scold her that this was no time to be worrying about him and that she should have just waited. Kimura looked down at her quietly as she breathed his name in overwhelming relief. Kneeling on the dirt path before him, Kawashima confessed that she had felt like he was going to completely disappear. Kimura blinked in complete confusion at her dramatic admission. Keeping her head bowed and her eyes hidden behind her hair, Kawashima quietly called out to him. She sincerely asked him where all of his endless kindness actually came from. Before he could answer, Kawashima jolted in horror as she suddenly noticed a stream of blood running down his forearm. She frantically shoved a stack of towels toward his face, stammering that he was bleeding, but Kimura casually brushed it off and claimed it was not a big deal. Kawashima stared at him with wide, completely panicked eyes, utterly terrified by his injury. Kimura silently looked back at her with a calm expression. Kimura suggested they call for help first and asked if she had her phone since his was waterlogged, prompting Kawashima to quickly agree. Kawashima stared at her phone screen in shock as she realized there was no signal. Kawashima awkwardly informed him that she had no signal, leaving Kimura to repeat the words in disbelief. Kimura asked to see the phone, and Kawashima quickly handed it over to him. Kimura carefully inspected the phone screen while Kawashima watched him closely. Kimura raised the phone high into the air until it suddenly let out a connection beep. Kimura casually announced that he got a signal, leaving Kawashima completely shocked as she realized the lack of service was simply due to her short height. With the phone holding a full connection, Kimura instructed her to go ahead and contact them, and a flustered Kawashima agreed. Kawashima suddenly froze in dread as she stared at the screen, prompting a confused Kimura to ask if she was serious. Kawashima nervously called out Kimura's name. With a desperate look, Kawashima asked if he could send the message for her instead. Kimura pointed out that he would end up seeing her chat history if he did, but she quickly assured him that it was completely fine. Kawashima nervously handed the phone back over to him. Kimura silently stared down at the screen. Kimura calmly announced that the message had been read, causing Kawashima to sigh in deep relief. Looking down guiltily, Kawashima murmured that she honestly thought she was going to be the one coming to his rescue. With a self-deprecating smile, Kawashima admitted that she just ended up being the one who needed saving after all. Kimura's eyes widened slightly in quiet surprise at her words. Turning his back to start walking down the path, Kimura quietly called her name and remarked that it would have been perfect if I had been the one to find her instead. Kawashima simply replied no. Kimura looked back at her in surprise. Kawashima hesitantly started to speak as the wind rustled through the trees. With a warm, tearful smile, Kawashima confessed that she was genuinely glad it was him who found her, prompting a slightly flustered Kimura to awkwardly agree. Kimura suggested they head back as they resumed walking down the path. Kawashima cheerfully agreed, and the two of them walked back together to rejoin the rest of the group. The broken suspension bridge was now completely blocked off by safety cones and a barricade bar. Kimura loudly apologized to the group, deeply bowing his head and clapping his hands together in a desperate plea for forgiveness. I reassured him not to worry since it did not turn into a huge disaster, while a still panicked Kimura internally considered getting an exorcism or a ward against evil. Takabe scolded Ai for charging in out of nowhere and scaring her, while Kawashima nervously looked on. Takabe pointed out that they were just lucky there was a river down below, to which Kimura agreed, leaving Kawashima staring at him in quiet realization. Ai frantically apologized again, flailing around as he blamed his terrible luck and insisted the accident was entirely his fault, while Kimura watched him with a deadpan expression. Kimura calmly reassured him that the old bridge was bound to collapse eventually regardless, making a dizzy Ai question if that was really true. Chapter 21 began with Kawashima's resolve, depicting her staring ahead as butterflies fluttered around her. The group of four finally arrived together at the camp building. Kawashima happily announced that their classes were supposed to carry the stacked firewood supplies, while Kimura internally worried that she still had not invited Ai to the campfire yet. Ai cheerfully grabbed a log but immediately fumbled and dropped it heavily to the ground. Takabe effortlessly hoisted a massive log onto her shoulder and mocked Ai by calling him a scrawny eggplant, asking if he was okay while he groaned in defeat, and Kawashima cried out in shock. Fuming, Ai turned around and aggressively asked what she had just said, completely ignoring Kimura's frantic warning to watch out as he blindly backed up into him. Ai and Kimura ended up awkwardly pressed face to face, both blushing furiously as Kawashima watched from the background in sheer shock. Kimura and Kawashima both panicked instantly, their eyes widening in pure horror at the sudden accidental intimacy between the two boys. Kimura quickly shoved a box into Ai's head, shouting that it was as bad, while Ai cried out in pain, leaving a heavily blushing Kawashima completely freaked out by what she had just witnessed. Takabe casually carried her massive log away while mocking Ai for blaming his usual condition again, prompting a struggling Ai to angrily tell her to shut up, while Kimura let out an exasperated sigh. Ai suddenly turned and desperately begged someone to dance around the campfire with him. Kimura internally noted that this was the classic heroine glazing event where a character boosts a girl's status by publicly asking her out to the campfire dance. Kimura turned his head, firmly betting to himself that Takabe was obviously the one who was going to get asked out. A stern-looking student with glasses bluntly rejected Ai with a hell no, completely shocking Kimura, who yelled out in disbelief that Ai had actually asked him instead. Kimura confusedly asked how he managed to get asked out by a guy, which prompted the student to defensively ask what he meant by that. The student smugly brushed his hair and boasted that there were plenty of guys into his type, since he was quite the cutie, leaving a deadpan Kimura to question if he seriously just called himself that. Kawashima suddenly walked over and cheerfully pointed out that Minato was in class, a surprising Ai who asked if they knew each other, while Kimura instantly panicked. Takabe walked up and asked who the new person was while telling them to stop dawdling, leaving a sweating Kimura to realize in sheer horror that Ai might actually make the connection between his past love and Minato right then and there. Kawashima casually introduced Minato as her little brother, while Minato corrected that they were actually twins, leaving Ai completely shocked that she had a twin brother, while Kimura breathed a sigh of relief that their secret was still safely hidden. Kimura internally reasoned that since Ai still remembered the kid from his past as a girl, he likely would not connect the dots so easily, while Takabe hummed curiously beside them. Takabe flashed a mischievous grin and told Minato to take off his glasses for a second, prompting a frantic Kimura to mentally scream for her to stop trying to connect the dots. Takabe excitedly cheered for him to take them off so she could see two identical faces lined up together, while a confused Minato asked why, and Kimura furiously panicked that Ai was definitely going to figure it all out. Minato muttered about how annoying they were being and began sliding his glasses off, causing Ai to jolt in sudden realization. As Minato stood directly beside Kawashima without his glasses, Takabe loudly marveled at how incredibly alike the two siblings looked, while Kimura let out a massive breath of relief that they had somehow survived the moment. Staring intensely at Kimura desperately pleaded in his mind for the male lead to just stay completely dense and oblivious to the truth. Takabe teasingly suggested putting Manato's hair in twin tails, prompting Kimura to mentally panic that it was a forbidden move. Kimura nervously realized that would definitely notice the resemblance if she made him look any more like Kawashima, while an excited Takabe begged to style his long hair just for a bit. Manato firmly refused, arguing she was being way too pushy even as she offered to lend him her hair ties. Letting out an annoyed sigh, Manato bluntly remarked that Takabe sure had a smooth tongue. Suddenly leaned in with a completely shocked expression and demanded to know if Manato had coated his hair with oil or something. Let out a confused noise as he suddenly slipped and dropped to the ground, triggering a brief flash of a childhood memory where a young Manato stood beside him. Takabe, Kawashima, and Kimura all stared in sheer confusion at Ai's sudden fall. Pointing a trembling finger at Manato as he adjusted his glasses, Ai stammered in complete disbelief, slowly realizing the truth and asking if it was really him. Ai screamed in pure shock that the girl from his past was actually a guy all along, leaving a horrified Kimura to mentally yell that the classic childhood friend trope had just been completely reversed. Manato confusedly asked what he was even talking about, while a frantic Kimura internally cursed and wondered how Ai had figured it out, questioning if there was some hidden keyword he had missed. A desperate Ai frantically asked how he could not remember how they used to play together when they were little, specifically bringing up how they would eat grass at the park. Staring blankly, Manato bluntly stated that he had absolutely no memory of living such a broke-ass childhood, leaving Ai to awkwardly repeat his harsh words. Takabe cringed intensely and muttered in disgust about them eating wild grass, prompting an embarrassed Ai to yell at her to stop cringing. As a confused Ai continued to panic in the background, Kawashima looked down in silent despair, while Kimura grimly noted that her little brother had completely beaten her to the punch. Without a word, Kawashima firmly grabbed her pigtails and began pulling the hair ties out of her hair. With her hair now let down and a deeply serious expression on her face, Kawashima placed a hand over her chest. A confused Ai slowly turned around as Kawashima quietly called out his name to get his attention. As leaves gently fluttered through the air, Kawashima began to confess about the girl he used to play with when they were little. Standing firmly in front of the completely stunned group, Kawashima finally revealed the truth and boldly declared that it had been her all along. A text bubble finished Kawashima's sentence, noting that the girl he used to play with when they were little. Kawashima firmly declared that it was actually her. Ai let out a loud sound of confusion, while a shocked Kimura realized that she had finally said it. Chapter 22 began with Kawashima resting in a patch of tall grass. A stunned Ai started to ask if Kawashima was really his childhood friend, while a confused Takabe questioned the same thing. Ai brought up the bullies and deduced that the person who fought off all those kids by herself back then was actually Kawashima. Kawashima looked down and corrected him, stating that Manato was the one who did it, while Manato realized he was talking about the kids who bullied his sister. Kawashima explained that her brother used to dress up as her, sometimes prompting Kimura to note that Manato's cross-dressing habit had just been completely exposed. Takabe bluntly agreed that the situation was scary, while Ai stared blankly upward in shock. With a sigh, Manato reasoned that with bullying, even if someone stepped in to help, it would just keep happening, unless the victim fought back themselves. Sliding his glasses up with a confident smile, Manato explained that he simply took her place to get payback for her prompting someone to note that his logic was really extreme. Manato casually announced he did not want to do any chores and turned his back on them to leave. Takabe angrily yelled at Manato for trying to skip out, while a completely overwhelmed Ai frantically stuttered for everyone to wait. Ai's mind reeled with confusion as he realized there were actually two of them involved in his past, while Kimura worried that the confusion was completely taking over. Carrying a log, Takabe asked Ai if he was not happy to be reunited with his childhood friend, to which Ai nervously claimed he was just getting ahead of himself, though Kimura quickly pointed out that he had confessed to her before. Takabe flashed a wide, teasing grin, prompting Ai to tell her to stop giving him that look. Kimura asked Takabe if any of this bothered her, since she was Ai's fiancé, to which she bluntly replied that it did not really matter to her. Lifting her log, Takabe explained that the situation was fine with her as long as she could fulfill her father's wish. Takabe added that even if the engagement gets called off, It was Ai's family's debt that would go up, so it did not hurt her at all. Ai noted that her motivation was just about money before his thoughts drifted back to the past. Ai recalled feeling completely powerless as he watched a young Kawashima get her pigtails painfully pulled by bullies. Ai recalled that, before he even realized it, she had managed to sort the entire situation out all by herself, remembering how the bullies had mysteriously ended up strung upside down from a tree branch. Ai noted that she was the kind of girl who always noticed things everyone else ignored, adding that she had still shown him that his actions actually held meaning. Ai admitted that he had always admired her incredible resilience, firmly stating that the reason he was who he was today was entirely thanks to that girl. Ai confessed that he really wanted to tell her that, but suddenly spiraled into deep confusion as he desperately tried to figure out which twin was actually the girl he had been thinking about this entire time, rambling endlessly about where Kawashima ended and her brother began. Ai frantically questioned where he should even begin, prompting a shocked Kimura to yell that he was getting way too philosophical, before turning away to calmly state that it did not really matter which one it was. Kimura reminded him that whatever the actual circumstances were back then, it did not change the fact that Ai had worked incredibly hard. Kimura firmly suggested that Ai should just tell Kawashima how he felt, deciding to himself that it was finally time to correct the course of the plan. Later, the group arrived at a large storage building to gather their supplies. Inside the storage building, Kawashima jolted in surprise as Kimura quietly approached her from behind. Kimura pointed out how reluctant she had been to speak up earlier and admitted his surprise that she had actually revealed they were childhood friends, asking if she only changed her mind because it seemed like they were going to mistake her for her brother. Kawashima silently looked down with a deeply guilty expression. Kimura casually stated that all that was left was for her to invite Ai to the campfire, but suddenly stopped and asked what she was doing as she crouched down by the shelves. Kawashima explained that she noticed a piece of wood sticking out and thought it might be dangerous when everyone came to clean up later, leaving Kimura staring at her in silence. Kimura warmly remarked that she really was always looking out for other people. Kawashima immediately countered that the one who was always looking out for other people was actually Kimura himself, recalling a time he had quietly fixed the tall shelves for everyone. Kimura blinked in surprise and simply repeated her words, questioning if she really meant him. Kawashima confessed that she had gotten really anxious back, then prompting a confused Kimura to ask what she meant. She specifically brought up how he had fearlessly jumped off the broken bridge earlier without a single second thought for his own safety. Kimura quickly realized she was talking about his jump into the river and nervously tried to brush it off again by explaining the drop was not that high, but Kawashima suddenly cut him off. Kawashima firmly asked what he would have done if there had not been a river down below to catch him. Kawashima confidently bet that. She continued asserting that whether the drop was high or if there was a river below, he would have just jumped in without stopping to think about any of it. She explained that what he did was not just brave or courageous, noting that she sensed a recklessness in him that could not simply be brushed off with words like that. Looking toward his feet, she added that it was almost as if he was thinking of himself as completely expendable, leaving Kimura standing quietly with his back turned. Kimura awkwardly tried to brush her concern off by claiming she was exaggerating, but Kawashima firmly called his name. She recalled how a light was shone on her back during her childhood. Kawashima stared forward with deep, unwavering resolve. She silently declared to herself that this time she would be the one to do the same for him. Stepping firmly toward a stunned Kimura, Kawashima stated that she wanted to know what the missing piece inside of him was. She held her hand out to him and firmly asked him to take it. As the wind rustled the leaves around them, she boldly asked him to dance with her at the campfire. Leaning forward intensely, Kawashima repeated that she wanted to know what that missing piece inside of him was. She reached her hand out toward him and asked him to take it. Looking directly into his eyes, she asked him to dance with her at the campfire. Kawashima firmly added that this was not a request, leaving Kimura staring at her in sheer surprise. Chapter 23 began with a title page showing Kawashima and Takabe holding hands, while lying opposite each other, depicting them as the winning and losing heroines existing like two mirrors facing one another. A sweating Kimura frantically asked what she was talking about, arguing that I was the one she should be inviting right now no matter what. Kimura nervously asked if she was getting the wrong idea again, attempting to remind her of what he had already told her before. As rain dripped outside, Kawashima called his name and explained that it was because she was sure he would. continue to do this forever and never dance with anyone. A flustered Kimura frantically tried to stop her, but Kawashima held her hand out and told him to take it if he felt like dancing. Kimura nervously pointed out that it was the campfire and asked if she even understood what that implied, to which she replied that it was not about romance. Looking down, Kawashima clarified that right now she was not asking him out in a romantic way. As rain poured outside, she explained that she just needed to confirm something. She told him that depending on whether he took her hand, she would find out what it was that was making him act this way. Rain continued to heavily pour down on the large camp building outside. Reaching her hand out again, Kawashima repeated that she wanted to know what the missing piece inside of him was. She firmly asked him to take her hand. Kimura looked away and quietly asked what she was talking about. Dropping her hand and turning her back to him, Kawashima stated that just as she thought, he was not going to take her hand. She quietly added that she understood now. Kimura stared forward with a silent, serious expression. Later, the students sat gathered on the floor of a room while a teacher stood next to a whiteboard, announcing that the event was cancelled due to rain. The teacher stood at the front of the quiet room filled with seated students. Sitting in the crowd, Kimura thought to himself that this whole world was a romantic comedy centered around Ai. Glancing over at Kawashima, Kimura concluded that she was the losing heroine. Kimura internally noted that she was kind from the very beginning, attractive, undeniably cute, and possessed a pressing aura that practically screamed she loved him. Kimura silently stared ahead with a deeply serious expression. Looking at Kawashima's bright smile, Kimura admitted to himself that he desperately wanted to see a world where a losing heroine like her actually won. Kimura thought about how he heard the campfire was cancelled, heavily worrying about what would happen to their plan if that turned out to be true. Sitting beside him, Takabe angrily complained about the cancellation, even after they had gone through all the trouble of preparing for it, though she eventually sighed and admitted there was nothing they could do about it. Inside the gym, Takabe groaned about how tired she was, complaining that they were worked to the bone preparing for the campfire, only to be forced to exercise inside instead. She casually added that she was getting pretty sick of the campfire stuff anyway, prompting a confused Kimura to ask if she was really sick of it. Watching the other students play dodgeball, Takabe explained that it just felt like she was being forced to watch a normal romance play out, leaving Kimura staring at her in complete confusion. Kimura sat down next to her and admitted he had been wondering why she was in an arranged marriage since they had briefly talked about it before. Takabe quietly revealed that her mother had passed away when she was young. She explained that there was quite an age gap between her parents, prompting Kimura to ask if her mother was the older one, but she simply replied no. Takabe clarified that her father was actually the older one, estimating the age gap to be about 30 years. She explained that her mother got cancer, and because she was young, her condition worsened very quickly, leaving Kimura to listen with a concerned expression. Takabe solemnly recalled the day her mother's coffin was carried out. She noted that the cherry blossoms were blooming so much that day that it actually made her feel physically sick. Staring up at the heavily blooming trees in her memory, Takabe stated that she knew right then she would never forget that exact sight. She explained that since she was his only child, her father kept telling her over and over again about his fears. He had firmly promised that he would never let her be alone, but Takabe let out a heavy sigh and admitted that she never expected what would happen next. As a stray ball suddenly flew past and hit someone in the background, Takabe complained that she never expected his promise would literally lead to him arranging a marriage for her. She realized that making sure she had a family of her own was his way of ensuring she was never left alone, concluding that it was basically her father's only source of emotional support. She grumbled that he called living together just a form of bridal training and had even commanded her to get married and start a family right after graduating high school. Takabe groaned about how much she hated it, while Kimura noted that she was apparently just going along with his extreme demands. Kimura pointed out that she was smart and felt like she could easily figure out a way out of the situation instead of letting it limit her own options. Staring up at the bright gym ceiling, Takabe quietly scoffed and muttered as if she had any other options to begin with. Smiling softly, Takabe explained that she had to respect her father's feelings by showing him she had built a family of her own, noting that the time to put his mind at ease was limited. Takabe apologized for bringing up depressing stuff and told Kimura not to push himself too hard, either leaving him to stare at her in silence. Takabe asked if his parents ever said anything to him, assuming his situation, just made them worry, to which Kimura simply replied, "Not really." A confused Takabe asked about his mom, pointing out that his dad was usually not home anyway. Kimura looked down and quietly explained that it was just him and his dad, prompting Takabe to let out a loud whistle and declare that they were in the same boat. Takabe leaned in with fierce excitement and demanded to know why, asking if it was a divorce. A sweating Kimura argued that it was not fair if he was the only one spilling his life story, complaining that she was being way too pushy. Kimura fell silent for a moment before quietly stating that, from what his dad told him, he revealed that his mother had passed away, causing Takabe to gasp in surprise and note that they had that in common too. Staring ahead seriously, Takabe confessed that every year when she caught the scent of spring arriving, she felt so lonely and missed her mother so much that she felt like the little girl she used to be all over again. Takabe looked over at Kimura and asked if he had a scent that he just could not forget either. Kimura held his water bottle and quietly looked out at the rustling leaves nearby. Kimura silently stared through the thick green foliage. As a train loudly passed by outside, Kimura recalled a warm, damp gust of wind. He remembered that wind mixing with the faint scent of earth and greenery. Recalling his childhood self walking home under the loud trees, he noted to himself that it was a soft smell. Snapping back to reality, Kimura deadpanned that of course he did not have one, arguing that her memory was probably just pollen or yellow dust. A fuming Takabe aggressively pointed at him and yelled that seasons definitely had their own scent, using spring and summer as examples. Gripping his water bottle, Kimura bluntly replied that he did not like spring or summer anyway. Kimura took a gulp of water and complained about the pollen, the humidity, and how quickly the cherry blossoms fell. Takabe flashed a wide grin and admitted that she was not a fan of them either. Takabe expressed that she was glad, pointing out that they actually had a lot in common when she thought about it, to which Kimura agreed that it was surprisingly true. Flashing a bright smile, Takabe cheerfully declared that the two of them might actually really understand each other. Kimura turned his back and walked away down the stairs, casually dismissing her idea by stating that he did not know about that. Heavy rain continued to pour down over the sprawling exterior of the large camp building. In their room, Kimura was surprised to hear that there was a mix-up with class as boys' room, meaning another guy was going to stay with them. Kimura stared blankly as a sudden sense of dread washed over him, silently hoping it was not who he suspected. Minato entered the room and immediately complained about the low-quality room he had been assigned to, triggering a loud scream of disbelief from both Ai and Kimura. Ai stood frozen in front of Minato, completely overwhelmed by the realization that the person he had been admiring all this time was actually standing right in front of him. Ai trembled violently as he muttered that Minato really was a guy, prompting a confused Kimura and Minato to discuss how strangely he had been acting for a while. Ai quietly confessed that when they were little, he had truly believed Minato was a girl. Minato flashed a smug grin and mockingly asked if that was really the case. Stepping closer to a stunned Ai, Minato teasingly told him it was too bad, but the person he met was indeed him. Minato smirked mischievously and asked if he really looked that much like a girl back then, or if there was another reason Ai was so flustered. Minato mockingly asked if Ai was still attracted to him even after finding out he was a guy, causing a flustered Ai to scream in panic and deny it, while Kimura deadpanned that Minato was totally messing with him. Wiping sweat from his forehead, Ai nervously asked why Minato was coming onto him like that, suddenly fearing the worst. Shaking in pure terror, Ai pointed at Kimura and asked if he was also in on it, nervously questioning if everyone in the entire room was secretly harboring feelings for him. Ai spiraled into absolute panic, imagining a relationship chart where both Minato and Kimura had massive crushes on him, though it was entirely a misunderstanding. Later in the public bath, Kimura asked what Ai was muttering about, causing a startled Ai to quickly jump and claim it was absolutely nothing. Nearby in the women's bath, someone let out a sudden sneeze. Kawashima wrapped a towel around herself and asked if she could sit next to Takabe, who cheerfully agreed. Relaxing in the warm water, Takabe let out a heavy sigh and complained about how exhausted she was. Takabe quietly studied Kawashima's face as her childhood friend looked down with a deeply troubled and serious expression. Takabe noted that she could easily see why Kawashima looked so troubled, causing a surprised Kawashima to jolt. Shiveringly, Takabe joked that finding out her own brother was basically an apparition of her past self sounded like something straight out of a horror story, leaving Kawashima completely baffled. Moving past the jokes, Takabe told her that in any case she should not try to handle everything entirely on her own. Takabe warmly reassured her that she should not worry about things by herself, offering to listen and help whenever anything happened, prompting a grateful Kawashima to softly thank her. Takabe jokingly added that most problems could be solved with money, which drew a light-hearted laugh from Kawashima, though Takabe's expression quickly softened as she seriously admitted that she was genuinely worried about her. Takabe playfully listed all of Kawashima's academic struggles, pointing out how she immediately forgot whatever she was taught, was terrible at studying, constantly ranked last on exams, and always ended up buried in coursework. Kawashima winced and whimpered, admitting that she was already well aware of all her shortcomings. Washing herself, Takabe quietly pointed out that precisely because Kawashima possessed those exact qualities, there were certain things only she could truly understand. Turning around with a bright grin, Takabe confidently declared that she actually had a great deal of faith in her, completely shocking Kawashima with her sudden and bold display. A heavily blushing Kawashima stammered out a comment about Takabe's impressive figure, leaving a confused Takabe to blink in silence. Kawashima nervously complimenting Takabe's beautifully slender waist, though Takabe casually brushed it off by replying that she had actually gained a bit of weight recently. Back in their D-room, I tore open a snack and explained that his family was actually quite poor. I explained to Minato and Kimura that because his family could not afford video games or a phone back in elementary school, he had absolutely no way of keeping in touch with them. Taking a bite of his snack, I beamed with joy and warmly confessed that he was just incredibly happy they had managed to meet again like this. Minato stared blankly at his phone and bluntly retorted that even if I told him those things, he already knew them, leaving a panicked I to frantically shout in response. I continued to eagerly munch on his snack while crying about how the twin he thought was not Kawashima actually turned out to be her, while Minato silently noted that Kawashima still had a very long road ahead of her, and a tired Kimura quietly left the room to use the restroom. As Kimura stepped back into the room, he suddenly heard a loud hiccup from I. Kimura turned his head in confusion as I hiccuped yet again. Staring blankly at his snack, a visibly dazed I mumbled about that girl from his past. I suddenly burst into loud, tearful wails, crying out that she had actually been a guy all along, completely shocking a panicked Kimura, who demanded to know what was wrong with him all of a sudden. A frantic Kimura demanded to know what had happened, to which Minato casually replied that he had no idea, though he noted I had finished eating the snack in a split second, as Kimura took the wrapper to inspect it. Kimura stared in pure disbelief at the ingredients label, which stated the dorayaki contained 0.1% alcohol, realizing in horror that I had actually managed to get completely drunk just from eating a single snack. Minato let out an annoyed sigh, muttering about what an extreme lightweight I was for getting drunk on a simple sweet, while a completely dazed I stumbled in the background. Staggering around the room, I tearfully slurred that ever since that childhood meeting, he had wanted to get stronger, and had worked incredibly hard mastering judo. I suddenly collapsed to the floor, dramatically demanding to know why Minato was cross-dressing in a skirt, and asking if he was actually a girl at heart, while a sweating Kimura realized the situation had descended into absolute chaos. Pointing an accusing finger, I angrily yelled that even Kawashima hardly ever wore skirts, declaring that Minato was actually more of a girl than any real girl. Minato calmly pointed out that he was not the one at fault, since I was the one who had misunderstood everything, prompting I to sway unsteadily and mutter that he finally saw how it was. Wobbling forward with a dazed smile, I reached out and told them to watch him, because he had worked incredibly hard, while a heavily sweating Kimura frantically tried to force a glass of water into his hand to calm him down. In his drunken state, I suddenly grabbed Kimura and executed a perfect judo throw, launching him cleanly over his shoulder. Kimura's vision violently spun upside down as he plummeted toward the floor. Kimura hit the floor with a massive crash, letting out a painful cry of agony, while I casually swayed back and forth on his feet. I wobbled on his feet, flashing a completely vacant drunken grin with dizzy spirals in his eyes. Out in the hallway, Manaka's phone began to play a cheerful ringtone as she received an incoming call from Minato. When Manaka answered, Minato requested that she switch to a video call, leaving her deeply confused, but willing to agree. Manaka tapped her screen and switched the call to video mode, bringing her face into view. Minato held his phone up to display a completely drunk and sprawling Ai who dizzily raised a hand toward the camera. Manaka stared intently at the screen, her eyes widening in absolute petrified shock. A sudden, overwhelming flash of shock completely engulfed her mind. Manaka stood entirely frozen in place, her mind comically spiraling back through human history and the dawn of evolution as she struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. In the background, a panicked Kimura desperately yelled at Minato to stop filming their chaotic room. The call suddenly disconnected with a sharp beep. As Minato casually noted, she had hung up on them, while a concerned Takabe asked a completely frozen and steaming Manaka what was wrong.